It was the longest battle of the Second World War, fought not across the fields of Europe or the skies of the Pacific, but upon the endless, merciless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. From the very first days of September 1939 until the twilight of victory in 1945, a struggle unfolded across those grey and storm-lashed waters, a struggle that determined whether Britain would stand or fall, whether supplies would flow or be severed, whether the Allies could endure long enough to strike back at the Axis. It was a war of endurance, fought not in a single day or in a single clash, but in countless convoys, endless patrols, and desperate duels beneath and above the waves. The Atlantic became a graveyard for merchant ships and submarines alike, where tonnage was measured not only in steel and cargo, but in human lives. The German U-boat fleet, silent hunters prowling beneath the waves, sought to choke Britain into submission by sinking the lifeline of supplies, food, fuel, weapons, and men, streaming across from North America. For every ship that slipped beneath the surface, families went hungry, armies went undersupplied, and nations trembled on the edge of collapse. Facing them were the merchant sailors and their naval escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and patrol aircraft, ordinary men who braved storms and torpedoes alike to keep the arteries of war pumping. Their task was simple in its mission, yet monumental in its cost, to keep the Atlantic open, no matter the sacrifice. In this battle, technology evolved at a breathtaking pace. The Allies pioneered radar, sonar, and high-frequency direction finding, while the Germans perfected Wolfpack tactics, striking under cover of night with devastating precision. Aircraft extended their reach into the mid-Atlantic gap, turning the hunters into the hunted. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park cracked Enigma, tilting the balance of intelligence in the Allies' favor, and yet for years the outcome was far from certain. In 1942, the happy time for U-boat crews, Allied losses reached catastrophic levels. Convoys burned on the horizon, survivors drifted in lifeboats, and the seas themselves seemed to weep with oil and ash. But courage did not falter. Sailors endured sleepless nights, listening for the whine of incoming torpedoes. Pilots flew endless sorties, scouring the waters for periscopes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Scientists and engineers worked feverishly, creating new weapons to strike back against the unseen enemy beneath the waves. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. By 1943, the hunters had become the hunted. Wolfpacks were torn apart, U-boats were sunk faster than they could be built, and the Atlantic, once a battlefield of despair, became a corridor of hope, carrying men and machines that would eventually liberate Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a naval campaign, it was the very heartbeat of the war, the struggle that made all others possible. Without victory in the Atlantic, D-Day could never have been launched. Without the convoys, Britain could never have endured. Without those who fought and died upon the sea, the outcome of the war itself might have been very different. Tonight, we will journey across those endless waters. We will follow the convoys, trace the paths of the U-boats, listen to the voices of sailors and survivors, and witness the technological arms race that decided the fate of nations. From the terror of Wolfpack attacks to the relief of convoy rescue, from the first days of war to the final collapse of the U-boat fleet, we will uncover the full story of the longest, hardest battle of the Second World War. So wherever you are tuning in from, whether it is morning in Europe, afternoon in America, or night in Asia, settle in, let the weight of history surround you, and allow yourself to drift into the story. This is the entire Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats versus convoys, a saga of courage, sacrifice, and survival in the unforgiving seas of World War II. The Second World War would give birth to countless clashes of steel and fire, but its longest battle was fought on water so vast it seemed endless. For Britain, survival itself depended on the sea, with 9 out of every 10 tons of food, fuel, and raw materials carried across the ocean in merchant hulls. The British Isles were a fortress only in geography, vulnerable in sustenance, for their fields could not feed their people nor their factories sustain war without imported cargo. Each convoy that sailed from Halifax, Freetown, or New York carried the lifeblood of an empire: wheat in sacks, oil in tankers, steel in ingots, and soldiers packed into liners converted to troopships. The Germans knew this weakness as intimately as Britain's admirals did, for strangulation by blockade had nearly brought Berlin to its knees in 1918. The new war would see roles reversed, Britain once again an island under siege, Germany the predator hunting on the high seas. In this struggle, the ocean itself became a battlefield, indifferent yet decisive. Its storms could scatter convoys as effectively as torpedoes, and its distances stretched escorts to exhaustion. Yet from the very first days it was clear the Atlantic would decide more than supplies. It would decide the fate of nations. The German Navy entered the war still scarred by the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, its ships limited and its ambitions curtailed for a generation, yet within its officer corps burned the memory of the First World War's U-boat campaign, when submarines had come close to cutting Britain's arteries. Karl Dönitz, a U-boat veteran, believed wholeheartedly that the submarine was the decisive weapon of naval warfare, not the battleship. To him, sleek hulls and torpedoes offered what Germany's surface fleet could not: the chance to bleed Britain quietly but relentlessly. While the Kriegsmarine possessed only 57 operational U-boats in 1939, Dönitz dreamed of 300, a number he deemed essential to starve the island nation. He drilled his captains in Wolfpack tactics, where coordinated submarines would overwhelm convoy defenses by night. Surface ships, though still symbols of prestige, were to him distractions from the true war of attrition. The doctrine he forged was not one of glory, but of mathematics. Tonnage sunk against tonnage replaced. Every cargo ship destroyed, he argued, was a step toward Britain's collapse. It was a cold calculation, but it was rooted in hard memory of what had once worked. Adolf Hitler, however, remained ambivalent about naval warfare, his focus fixed on the conquest of land empires rather than the mastery of seas. In Mein Kampf he had written little of the oceans, and even on the eve of war, he dismissed the possibility of challenging Britain's Royal Navy in open battle. Yet he allowed his admirals to develop commerce raiding strategies, seeing in them a cheap way to pressure Britain while his armies conquered Europe. The great battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz were built as symbols of prestige, but in practice they were too few to confront the enemy's fleets. Hitler's true naval weapon would be the U-boat arm, led by Dönitz and staffed by crews whose average age barely exceeded 20. These men would be sent into the Atlantic to prowl alone or in packs, unseen hunters armed with a handful of torpedoes and boundless faith in their commander. To Hitler, the U-boat campaign was not glamorous but necessary, a weapon to weaken Britain before the decisive blows fell on land. He never fully grasped the strategic significance of the Atlantic War, underestimating its role until too late. But he gave Dönitz his leash, and Dönitz seized it with ruthless focus. The Wolfpacks would become the sharks in the shipping lanes. The outbreak of war in September 1939 immediately unleashed this undersea menace. Within hours of Britain's declaration, U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia, sending 112 civilians to their deaths and foreshadowing the brutality to come. Though Hitler initially forbade unrestricted submarine warfare to avoid American outrage, the line between civilian and military blurred quickly in the vast Atlantic. Merchant ships carried food as well as ammunition, oil as well as soldiers, making every freighter a legitimate target in German eyes. U-boats stalked convoys by night, their periscopes slicing through moonlit waves before slipping below the surface to unleash sudden destruction. Depth charges answered from corvettes and destroyers, but escorts were too few to guard every vessel. Each torpedo that struck set off a chain of horrors, sailors scrambling for lifeboats, flames racing across oil slicks, and the cold Atlantic swallowing the unlucky. In the first months alone, hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping went down. What had been theory in staff rooms now became a reality of blood and loss on the open sea. The longest battle had begun in earnest. For the British, the opening phase was one of improvisation, scrambling to adapt a system forged in the previous war to modern conditions. Convoys were quickly reinstated, grouping merchant ships under the guard of escorts, but the sheer shortage of warships left long stretches unprotected. Old destroyers, many relics of the Great War, were pressed back into service, their crews untrained and their equipment outdated. Coastal command patrols scoured the sea lanes, but their aircraft lacked range, leaving the mid-Atlantic a deadly black pit. Shipping losses mounted, and morale in the merchant navy wavered as each voyage became a gamble with death. Yet the convoys persisted, for Britain could not choose otherwise. To stop the flow of supplies was to surrender. Civilian sailors, often derided as mere transporters, became frontline combatants in a war of endurance. Their survival, and by extension Britain's, now depended on cooperation between Navy, Air Force and intelligence. The early days tested this cooperation brutally, but they also forged the resolve that would carry Britain through. The German surface fleet attempted to join this war of attrition, sending pocket battleships like Admiral Graf Spee into the Atlantic to prey on merchant ships. Their raids caused panic, forcing the Royal Navy to divert heavy units in pursuit, but such sorties were costly and unsustainable. At the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939, Graf Spee was cornered and scuttled, a reminder that Germany's surface fleet could never dominate. The U-boats, however, required no bases of steel and coal, only the endless ocean in which to hide. They could strike in waters far from the reach of Allied escorts, surfacing at night to attack with impunity. Dönitz's captains became legends among their comrades, credited with dozens of sinkings, their reputations burnished in propaganda. But the reality behind the numbers was grim, for each success meant hundreds of Allied dead and tons of precious supplies lost. The German press hailed these victories as proof of technological and tactical superiority. In London, the Admiralty saw them as a looming existential threat, and both assessments were correct. Behind the surface clash of ships and submarines, the struggle for intelligence began almost immediately. German radio traffic guided Wolfpacks to convoys, and British direction-finding stations hunted these signals, trying to triangulate positions. Each message was encrypted with the Enigma machine, which German officers trusted implicitly as unbreakable. Yet already, Polish cryptographers had laid the groundwork for Allied efforts to penetrate the code. In 1939, they passed their findings to Britain, planting seeds that would grow into one of the war's greatest advantages. But in those first months, decryption was not yet reliable, leaving the Admiralty often blind. Sailors relied instead on luck, skill, and the endurance of their escorts. The Battle of the Atlantic, even in its infancy, was a contest not only of steel, but of information. And the first hints of this invisible war were already shaping events on the waves. The men who fought in those opening months could not yet know that this campaign would last the entire length of the war. From September 1939 to May 1945, the Atlantic would remain a battlefield without pause. Every ton of cargo, every convoy crossing, Every U-boat sortie became a move in a 6-year struggle. The sailors who stood watch on freezing decks, the submariners who endured claustrophobic patrols, and the airmen who searched endless horizons all carried the burden of an invisible front. To them, each day was survival, each night an ordeal. To their commanders it was a war of numbers, sinkings against replacements, losses against endurance. The Atlantic became a war of attrition, measured not in battleships sunk, but in bread loaves delivered, tanks landed, and factories supplied. Its scale was vast, its stakes absolute, and in those first months the world began to understand that the longest battle had truly begun. Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat arm, envisioned a naval war unlike the great clashes of dreadnoughts in the First World War. He believed in a strategy of strangulation, where Britain would not be destroyed in a single blow, but slowly bled through the loss of merchant shipping. His doctrine rested on mathematics. If Germany could sink more tonnage than Britain could replace, victory was inevitable. To achieve this, he needed not scattered lone hunters, but coordinated packs, striking convoys with overwhelming force. Radio became his weapon, allowing headquarters to direct submarines across thousands of miles of ocean. Each U-boat was an eye on the sea, reporting sightings that could summon others to converge on a target. When gathered, they attacked at night on the surface, where submarines moved faster than escorts, and radar was not yet widespread. This was the Wolfpack, a brutal tactic designed to overwhelm convoy defenses and terrify merchant sailors. To Dönitz, every successful attack proved the efficiency of his cold arithmetic, and to his crews it was validation of their deadly role as grey wolves. The fall of France in 1940 transformed Dönitz's vision from theory to reality by giving the U-boats forward bases. Ports at Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, and Saint-Nazaire provided direct access to the deep Atlantic, cutting transit time dramatically. Before France's collapse, U-boats had to sortie from Germany, wasting fuel and time crossing the North Sea and around Britain. Now they could emerge directly into the convoy routes with endurance and lethality increased. Vast concrete pens were constructed at these bases, impervious to Allied bombing, and inside them the submarines were serviced, repaired, and dispatched like predators from a lair. Crews arriving from patrols found momentary relief in occupied French towns, though they remained under strict discipline. Dönitz himself operated from Lorient, coordinating his flotillas with precise control. The bases became symbols of German naval power, massive fortresses of steel and concrete along the Atlantic wall. From them the Wolfpacks roamed the seas in ever-growing numbers, and from them the Atlantic War escalated into a true campaign of annihilation. Wolfpack tactics relied heavily on communications, an advantage and vulnerability in equal measure. When a U-boat sighted a convoy, it shadowed silently, transmitting bearings and course to Dönitz's headquarters. Other submarines, sometimes dozens, were then vectored to converge, forming a pack that could strike simultaneously. At night they surfaced to attack with torpedoes, exploiting their speed on the surface and the difficulty escorts faced detecting them. The convoy system, once thought impenetrable, now became a battlefield where escorts fought desperately against swarms of enemies. Radio coordination, however, left a trail of signals that Allied direction-finding stations soon began to exploit. Huff-duff triangulation revealed the positions of shadowing boats, leading escorts closer to their stalkers. But in the early years the Germans held the advantage, sinking merchantmen at a pace Britain could scarcely endure. The Wolfpack was not just a tactic, it was a system that turned scattered submarines into a collective predator, and for a time it seemed unstoppable. The psychology of the U-boat arm was central to its effectiveness, shaping its men into what propaganda called the Grey Wolves. Dönitz fostered a sense of elite brotherhood, telling his crews they were the decisive arm of the Reich. Life aboard a U-boat was harsh, cramped, and dangerous, but it forged bonds of loyalty among men who faced death together. They saw themselves as hunters in a vast ocean, stalking prey far from land and civilization. German propaganda magnified this image, portraying the submariners as fearless young warriors striking at Britain's heart. Successes were celebrated, commanders like Günther Prien of U-47 and Otto Kretschmer becoming heroes of the Third Reich. In truth, the strain was immense, with every patrol a gamble against death charges, hunger, and exhaustion. Yet the mystique of the U-boat arms sustained morale, convincing young men that they carried Germany's fate on their shoulders. The Wolfpack was not just strategy, it was an identity, and that identity gave the campaign its ferocity. Tactically, the Wolfpack imposed unbearable stress on convoy escorts, whose commanders often faced attacks from multiple directions at once. Corvettes and destroyers raced through the night, launching depth charges while merchant ships scattered in panic. Torpedoes ripped into tankers and freighters, explosions illuminating the night as flames danced across the sea. Sailors abandoned ship in lifeboats, watching helplessly as more hulls erupted around them. Escort captains had to choose between pursuing attackers and protecting their convoys, a decision that always carried fatal consequences. In some battles, convoys lost half their ships in a single night, the survivors limping on toward Britain. For the Germans, such victories reinforced the doctrine of massed attack, proving that coordination amplified destruction. Yet the very radio chatter that enabled Wolfpacks also offered allies the chance to listen, decode, and anticipate. The seeds of eventual German defeat lay buried within their early triumphs, but in 1940 and 1941 those seeds were yet unseen. The Wolfpack doctrine also reflected Dönitz's belief in total focus, his refusal to divide U-boat strength between multiple missions. Unlike Hitler, who still dreamed of great battleships and surface raids, Dönitz argued relentlessly for submarines as the core of naval warfare. He fought bureaucratic battles with the Kriegsmarine High Command, insisting on expanding his arm despite resource constraints. He pushed for more boats, more crews, and more training, knowing that numbers alone could tip the balance. Hitler, often distracted by land campaigns, gave only grudging support, never prioritizing the navy as he did the army or Luftwaffe. Still, Dönitz built his arm into an effective, disciplined force, one that often punched above its weight. The Wolfpacks became the sharpest edge of Germany's strategy against Britain, a weapon cheaper than fleets and harder to counter. Their success forced the Allies to pour resources into escorts, aircraft, and intelligence. It was a war of pressure, and for a time, Dönitz held the initiative. His doctrine had proven its terrible power. The expansion of Wolfpack warfare was not merely tactical, but strategic, threatening Britain's survival on a scale greater than any bomb or invasion. By 1941, U-boat sinkings reached levels that alarmed even Winston Churchill, who later admitted the submarine threat was the only thing that truly frightened him. Losses in tonnage far outpaced new construction, straining food supplies and threatening war production. British ports became choked with damaged or incomplete ships, while merchant sailors faced voyages they knew might be their last. The psychological toll rippled beyond the ocean, affecting public morale and government planning. Germany celebrated these victories as proof that Britain could be starved into submission. But Britain, though battered, refused to yield, mobilizing science, industry, and allies to fight back. The Wolfpack campaign was both a terror and a challenge, forcing innovation and resilience from those under attack. In its fury, it hardened Britain's resolve, and it ensured that the Battle of the Atlantic would become the war's longest and most decisive struggle. In the early years, the Wolfpacks seemed to embody inevitability, their hunts tearing holes in Allied shipping lanes with ruthless precision. But the Atlantic was vast, and the balance of technology and intelligence would soon begin to shift. Radar, longer-range patrol aircraft, and cryptanalysis would gradually erode the pack's advantage. The hunters would find themselves hunted, their coordination betrayed by their own reliance on signals. Yet, in 1940 and 1941, the Wolfpacks reigned supreme, giving Germany its most effective weapon against the Western Allies. Their legend grew, immortalized in propaganda, and feared by every merchant sailor who faced the Atlantic crossing. The doctrine of Wolfpack warfare had proven its worth in blood and steel. It forced the Allies into a war of survival, fought not in grand battles, but in nightly duels across endless seas. And it set the stage for the titanic contest of endurance that was only just beginning. To step inside a German U-boat during the Second World War was to enter a world of iron shadows and unrelenting pressure. The Type 7, backbone of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, was less than 220 feet long, with every inch crammed with machinery and men. Compartments doubled as sleeping quarters, dining areas and ammunition storage, leaving no space truly private. The steel hull sweated with condensation, dripping onto bunks and uniforms, creating an atmosphere always damp. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat and bilge water, producing a stench that clung to everything the crew touched. With 50 men aboard, the submarine felt suffocating, the air thick and stale as carbon dioxide levels rose. Every sound echoed, valves hissed, pumps throbbed, and the creak of the pressure hull reminded sailors of the ocean crushing outside. For newcomers, the first days were disorienting, their senses overwhelmed by heat, noise, and the sense of being entombed. Yet within this claustrophobic coffin, men lived, fought, and died on patrols lasting weeks or months. It was their battlefield, invisible and relentless. Food aboard a U-boat reflected both German efficiency and the constraints of limited space. Fresh bread and sausages were stacked in every nook when a patrol began, stuffed even into torpedo compartments and beneath bunks. Cabbages and potatoes hung from hooks, while chocolate and canned goods filled lockers. But as days passed, the bread grew moldy, the sausages soured, and vegetables rotted in the humid air. Refrigeration was minimal, and once supplies spoiled, meals became monotonous, reduced to canned pork, ersatz coffee, and powdered milk. The smell of food mingled with diesel oil and unwashed bodies, creating an odor so strong sailors joked it could sink ships before torpedoes. Fresh water was rationed, reserved for engines and cooking, not for washing. Men lived in the same sweat-soaked clothes for weeks. Hygiene was nearly impossible, with only a single sink for dozens of men and no showers. The constant grime became part of their identity, endured as the price of service beneath the waves. In these conditions, camaraderie mattered as much as rations, binding men together against discomfort. Daily life aboard followed a strict but exhausting routine dictated by the sea and the patrol schedule. Watches were divided into 4-hour shifts, with sailors alternating between duty and rest in endless cycles. Sleep was snatched in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, often hot-bunked, with one man climbing in as another climbed out. Space was so limited that only a fraction of the crew had dedicated beds, forcing constant rotation. On duty, sailors monitored engines, manned hydrophones, or stood periscope watch, ears straining for enemy propellers. Silence was enforced during submerged operations, every movement controlled to avoid betraying the boat's position. Meals were quick, eaten elbow to elbow in tiny mess spaces while the boat rocked with the sea. Letters from home were read and reread, treasured reminders of a world far removed from the Atlantic War. The monotony was broken only by sudden alarms, when the calm of routine shattered into chaos. Such was life inside the Wolf's lair, suspended between boredom and terror. Depth charging was the submariner's greatest fear, a terror that turned routine into nightmare within seconds. When escorts detected a U-boat, the order to dive was shouted, hatches slammed, and the boat plunged into darkness. Men braced as engines roared, then cut to silence, leaving only the eerie creak of the hull. Explosions followed, the sea itself seeming to hammer the steel walls, each blast threatening to tear the boat apart. Lights flickered, valves rattled loose, and pipes burst as depth charges fell closer. The air grew acrid with smoke and sweat, as sailors clutched rosaries, photographs, or each other. Silence was demanded, for even a dropped wrench could betray their position to sonar. Hours passed like years in such hunts, nerves stretched to the breaking point. When explosions faded, relief was tempered by the knowledge the enemy might still be listening. Every patrol carried this threat, making survival a victory in itself. The dangers were constant, but the rewards for those who believed in Dönitz's vision were intoxicating. Successful patrols that sank thousands of tons of shipping earned medals, promotions, and the admiration of comrades. Commanders like Otto Kretschmer and Günther Prien became legends, their names whispered with awe in U-boat pens and celebrated in propaganda films. To their crews, each sinking reinforced the belief that they were Germany's spearhead against Britain. The thrill of watching a freighter erupt in fire and smoke was matched by the knowledge that lives were ending in the waves. Yet for submariners hardened by war, pity was a luxury they could not afford. Each torpedo fired was a lifeline cut, a blow in the great struggle for survival between nations. For many, this cold arithmetic helped suppress the guilt of attacking unarmed merchantmen. To others, the war at sea became a brutalizing experience, stripping away innocence. And beneath the surface, conscience drowned as often as men did. Psychologically, the U-boat arm cultivated a unique sense of brotherhood, forged in shared hardship and mortal danger. Sailors trusted their captain implicitly, for one man's mistake could doom them all. The confinement of steel walls meant no escape from tension, yet also no escape from friendship. Stories were told in whispers, songs hummed in the dark, jokes shared to mask fear. Small rituals, like drinking ersatz coffee together at dawn, became anchors of sanity. Bonds formed that were deeper than family, forged in the knowledge that death might come at any moment. German propaganda labeled them the Grey Wolves, but among themselves they were simply Kameraden, comrades. This unity gave them strength during depth charge hunts and endless patrols, a resilience born from dependence. When one sailor was lost, it was as though part of the crew's soul had gone with him. Such bonds defined the submariner's experience as much as steel and machinery. Isolation was another constant companion, severing crews from the outside world for weeks on end. Radio silence often kept them blind to broader events, their only knowledge of the war coming from brief signals. Letters from home could not reach them until their return, leaving families as distant as the stars above. The ocean became their world, a shifting prison with no horizon but the periscope lens. Loneliness pressed hardest during the quiet stretches, when men lay awake in bunks, imagining what awaited at home. Some carried photographs, worn from constant handling, their edges curled from salt and oil. Others clung to superstition, charms or lucky objects believed to ward off death. The strain showed in faces hollowed by fatigue, in tempers frayed by confinement, in dreams haunted by explosions. For many, the hardest battles were fought not against escorts, but within their own minds, and victory meant simply returning alive to the base. To humanize the German submariner is to see beyond the steel hull and propaganda into lives lived in extremity. They were young, often barely 20, pulled from farms, schools, and factories to serve beneath the waves. They endured hunger, exhaustion, fear, and guilt, yet pressed on because duty and camaraderie demanded it. Their survival rates were among the lowest of the war, with nearly 3/4 of all U-boat sailors never returning home. Still, they climbed the ladders into their boats, sealing the hatches behind them, and vanished into the Atlantic night. To them, the ocean was not vast but intimate, a battlefield that pressed against their skin and lungs. Each patrol was a wager with fate, each return to port a narrow escape from death. They were hunters, yes, but also men trapped in a cycle of endurance and sacrifice. Their story is one of human resilience under inhuman strain, and it is this story that gives the Battle of the Atlantic its enduring gravity. Britain's first and most vital response to the U-boat threat was the revival of the convoy system, a strategy born from bitter lessons in the First World War. Instead of allowing merchant ships to cross the Atlantic alone, vulnerable to solitary hunters, they were grouped together in long, sprawling columns. Dozens of freighters, tankers, and liners moved in formation, shielded by a protective screen of naval escorts. The idea was simple: concentrated defense reduced losses and multiplied the chances of survival. Yet in practice, organizing convoys required immense coordination, from assembling ships at ports to maintaining tight discipline at sea. Each convoy moved at the speed of its slowest vessel, often a lumbering freighter struggling to keep pace. Gaps formed, columns stretched, and every straggler became easy prey. Still, convoys proved their worth almost immediately, cutting losses compared to independent sailings. To the sailors who braved the Atlantic, safety lay not in isolation, but in numbers. The convoy became both shield and symbol of Allied endurance. Protecting these convoys demanded a new kind of warship, small, numerous, and designed for constant patrol. Destroyers were the backbone of escort forces, fast and agile, armed with depth charges, guns, and sonar to hunt U-boats. But Britain had too few destroyers to cover every convoy, forcing the rapid construction of corvettes. These Flower-class ships, small and seaworthy, became icons of the Atlantic War, rolling wildly in heavy seas, but enduring storms that broke larger hulls. Manned by green crews, they patrolled tirelessly, their bows cutting through icy waves on voyages that lasted weeks. Later, frigates were added, blending range, speed, and endurance in a balance well suited to escort work. Each escort group became a floating family, crews bonded by the relentless struggle against unseen foes. They lived in cold and wet conditions, their ships often overloaded and undersupplied, but their presence meant life or death for the convoys they guarded. In the Atlantic, these humble warships carried the weight of empires. The Royal Navy bore the initial burden, but it was the Royal Canadian Navy that grew into the unsung giant of the Convoy War. At the outbreak of war, Canada possessed only a handful of destroyers and a few small ships, hardly a fleet, yet by 1945 it had grown into the third largest navy in the world, its expansion driven by the urgent need to escort convoys. Canadian corvettes and destroyers, manned by young sailors with little experience, became the lifeline of the North Atlantic, Johns became convoy hubs, their harbors choked with freighters waiting for escort. From these ports, Canadians sailed into the storm-lashed Atlantic, facing the same dangers as their British counterparts. Their ships were often smaller, their equipment primitive in the early years, but their determination was unshakable. They endured some of the hardest battles, holding the line in the critical mid-Atlantic gap. By war's end, Canadian sailors had written their courage into the history of the Atlantic struggle, and their role remains one of the campaign's greatest achievements. Convoy duty was grueling work, a constant test of endurance for escorts and merchantmen alike. The ships steamed in formation for days on end, engines pounding, crews staring into fog and rain for signs of periscopes or wakes. At night, blackout conditions cloaked the convoys in darkness, but the glow of burning cigarettes or a careless light could betray their position. Escorts patrolled the perimeter, sonar operators straining to detect faint echoes of submarines in the depths. When an attack came, chaos erupted, horns blaring, ships scattering, and escorts charging to drop depth charges. Merchant sailors knew their survival depended on holding formation, even as torpedoes struck and explosions shattered the night. Many described the sound of a torpedo hit as a sickening crunch, followed by a roar, the ship shuddering as steel bent and water poured in. Yet discipline held, as captains kept their vessels in line, and escorts threw themselves at the attackers. It was war by endurance, fought hour after hour, wave after wave, and in that endurance lay the strength of the convoy system. The convoy battle was as much psychological as it was physical. Merchant sailors, often civilians without military training, faced weeks of constant danger. They endured sleepless nights, listening for the boom of depth charges, never knowing if the next torpedo would strike their hull. Fear gnawed at them, but so too did monotony, as days of uneventful sailing stretched into weeks. Meals were eaten quickly, often interrupted by alarms, while storms battered the ships and froze their decks with ice. The ocean offered no rest. One day calm, the next a tempest that scattered ships and made escort work nearly impossible. Yet through it all, men found courage in routine, in the knowledge that thousands depended on their cargo. Camaraderie grew strong among crews, who shared hardships and losses as brothers. Songs, jokes, and letters from home became lifelines against despair. Convoy life demanded resilience, not just of steel, but of spirit. And in this resilience, the Allies found their shield. The convoy system also highlighted the constant tension between strategy and necessity. Britain needed supplies urgently, yet assembling ships into convoys delayed sailings and slowed the flow of goods. Faster ships, like passenger liners converted to troop carriers, sometimes sailed independently under the belief they could outrun U-boats. Industrialists complained of bottlenecks, while military planners demanded priority for tanks, aircraft, and munitions. Every decision carried risk, for too few convoys left merchantmen vulnerable, but too many ships in one convoy created massive targets. Admirals balanced demands from Churchill, commanders, and the economy, knowing each lost ship was a blow to the war effort. Meanwhile, Dönitz watched for weaknesses, striking at overloaded or poorly escorted convoys. The result was a constant chess match, with convoys as pawns and U-boats as predators. Behind every sailing lay debates, calculations, and sacrifices unseen by the men on deck. The convoy system was both salvation and compromise. Escorts themselves evolved into specialized groups, combining destroyers, corvettes, frigates, and even aircraft carriers. These hunter-killer groups roamed the seas, not only defending convoys, but actively seeking U-boats. Coordination grew tighter as the war progressed, with ships communicating by signals and aircraft providing reconnaissance. Escort commanders developed aggressive tactics, no longer content to simply defend, but determined to destroy their foes. Each success raised morale, proving that U-boats were not invincible. Training and doctrine improved, with veteran officers mentoring green crews and shaping them into lethal defenders. Escort groups became families in their own right, bound by missions and shared dangers. Their victories were rarely celebrated publicly, for secrecy was paramount, but their impact was profound. In the endless expanse of the Atlantic, they were the guardians of hope, and in their vigilance, convoys survived. By 1941, the convoy system had become the central pillar of Allied strategy in the Atlantic, a lifeline stretched across thousands of miles. It was not flawless, and losses remained staggering, but without convoys Britain would have collapsed. The system was proof that defense could be as decisive as offense, that survival itself could be a weapon. It forced Germany to concentrate its U-boats, exposing them to counterattack, while buying time for Allied industry to expand. The convoy was more than a tactical measure. It was a symbol of endurance, discipline, and collective sacrifice. Sailors, escorts, and commanders alike knew they were engaged in the war's longest test of will. Each crossing represented not just ships and cargo, but the very survival of nations. In the clash between Wolfpacks and convoys lay the heart of the Battle of the Atlantic, and in that struggle the future of the free world hung in the balance. The summer of 1940 brought catastrophe for Britain as France fell under the iron heel of the Wehrmacht. With French ports seized by the Germans, the Atlantic War was transformed overnight, for U-boats no longer had to slip through the narrow North Sea and around Britain's coast. Instead, they now sailed directly from Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. Their transit shortened, and their time in hunting grounds multiplied. These bases were quickly fortified, massive submarine pens built from thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. Each pen was a fortress, impervious to aerial bombardment, where U-boats could rest, refit, and reload in safety. Crews disembarked into occupied French towns, where propaganda hailed them as warriors of a new empire. For Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, this was the strategic opportunity he had long awaited. With bases so close to the Atlantic's arteries, he could unleash his wolves on Britain with renewed fury. The seas around the British Isles grew darker, deadlier, and more unforgiving, and Britain entered what sailors would remember as the first happy time. The phrase happy time was bitter irony, for it described not Allied fortune but German triumph. From late 1940 into 1941, U-boat commanders struck convoy after convoy, sinking merchantmen with devastating regularity. The Wolfpacks prowled at night, using surface speed to dart between escorts and unleash spreads of torpedoes. Ships exploded in fiery plumes, lighting the sea with burning oil and casting survivors into freezing waters. Tankers, freighters, and liners were sent to the bottom by the dozen, their cargoes of food, fuel, and weapons lost. British shipping losses soared, with hundreds of thousands of tons sunk month after month. Crews spoke of the Atlantic as a graveyard, where every voyage was a wager with death. Escorts, too few and ill-equipped, were overwhelmed, forced to choose which ships to save and which to abandon. In these grim months, the ocean itself seemed to belong to Germany, and Dönitz's wolves ruled the waves with ruthless efficiency. Each patrol told stories of devastation, and each sinking reinforced Dönitz's conviction that submarines alone could strangle Britain. Commanders like Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, and Günther Prien became legends, their sinkings celebrated in German newspapers. Kretschmer, known as Silent Otto, perfected the tactic of close-range night attacks, slipping between columns to fire torpedoes at point-blank range. Schepke, a charismatic commander, became the face of the U-boat force, while Prion was already a hero for his daring raid into Scapa Flow. Their exploits were not only military victories, but propaganda weapons, used to bolster morale at home and intimidate enemies abroad. British sailors cursed their names, while German schoolchildren memorized their victories. The aura of invincibility surrounded these men, even as the dangers they faced mounted with each patrol. For the U-boat crews, the happy time was intoxicating, proof that their sacrifices carried decisive weight. To Dönitz their successes were vindication of his doctrine, and to Britain they were a nightmare made real. Statistics told the grim truth. Britain was losing ships faster than it could build them. By early 1941, losses often exceeded 300,000 tons a month, a hemorrhage that threatened to starve the nation. Convoys were being ripped apart in the mid-Atlantic, where air cover was absent and escorts too few. Grain shipments dwindled, fuel stocks fell, and war production slowed under the weight of shortages. Churchill himself admitted in secret that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him. German naval planners believed they were on the brink of victory, convinced Britain would sue for peace before the year was out. Dönitz pressed Hitler for more submarines, arguing that a fleet of 300 boats could bring the island to collapse. In Berlin, the Kriegsmarine's voice was still muted compared to the army and Luftwaffe, but the results at sea gave weight to his demands, forcing Hitler to reconsider the submarine war. For a moment, the Atlantic seemed within Germany's grasp. Life aboard the U-boats during this period reflected the strange mixture of hardship and exhilaration. Patrols remained grueling, with weeks of cramped conditions, foul air, and constant danger. Yet the steady stream of victories buoyed morale, convincing crews their suffering had meaning. When they returned to bases in France, they were greeted as heroes, feted with parades, and awarded medals. Townsfolk in occupied Lorient and Brest looked on with awe as the grey wolves strode ashore in crisp uniforms. Photographs showed smiling young men, but behind the glamour lay exhaustion, survivor's guilt, and the knowledge that many comrades would never return. Even during the happy time, U-boat losses mounted, though not enough to blunt their impact. The German press concealed these losses, presenting only the victories. But among the crews, the price was understood all too well. Every patrol was a gamble, and luck could vanish in a single depth-charge attack. On the Allied side, despair mingled with determination. The Admiralty knew it could not abandon convoys, yet it struggled to find enough escorts to guard them. The Royal Navy diverted destroyers from fleet duties, while Canada scrambled to expand its tiny navy. Merchant sailors, often civilians, faced the brunt of the slaughter, their ships turned into floating coffins in the mid-Atlantic. Survivors told stories of clinging to rafts as comrades slipped into the sea, their cries swallowed by wind and waves. Escorts fought valiantly, launching depth charges at fleeting sonar contacts, but success was rare. In some battles, convoys lost half their number before reaching port, each voyage a bitter defeat. Yet Britain endured, relying on American lend-lease and shipyards to replenish losses. The sea lanes became both Britain's lifeline and its bleeding wound, and the nation prepared for a war of attrition it could not avoid. For Dönitz, the first happy time was vindication not only of strategy, but of faith in his men. He believed the U-boat arm was Germany's decisive weapon, the tool that could achieve what the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht could not. In his headquarters at Lorient, he tracked patrols obsessively, encouraging commanders and refining tactics. He spoke of his crews with paternal pride, calling them his boys, and they returned his devotion with fierce loyalty. His reports to Hitler painted a picture of near victory, pressing for expansion of the submarine fleet. Yet his triumph was not absolute, for the Allies were already adapting, developing new tactics, technologies, and intelligence. The Wolfpacks, though deadly, could not remain invisible forever. Radar, code-breaking, and long-range aircraft were already beginning to shape the tide. The happy time was real, but it was also fleeting, and its end was closer than Dönitz imagined. By mid-1941, cracks began to show in the U-boat's dominance. British scientists improved sonar, escorts gained experience, and convoys grew more disciplined. The arrival of American aid, though still limited, hinted at greater support to come. Losses remained high, but survival rates improved as escorts learned to fight more aggressively. U-boat aces like Prian and Shepke were lost. Reminders that even the most skilled commanders were mortal. Dönitz continued to believe in ultimate victory, but his window of opportunity was narrowing. The Wolfpacks still prowled, and Britain still bled, yet the tide of endurance was shifting. The happy time had proven the U-boat's power, but also revealed its limitations. It was a chapter of triumph for Germany and terror for Britain, and it was the prologue to an even greater struggle in the mid-Atlantic. The U-boat was a predator built on precision engineering, and its most lethal weapon was the torpedo. Sleek, 7 meters long, and weighing nearly 2 tons, each torpedo carried a warhead designed to rip open steel hulls like paper. Fired from tubes at the bow and stern, they could run at speeds of over 40 knots, guided only by gyroscopes and hope. Their destructive power was immense, capable of breaking a 10,000-ton freighter in half with one strike. Yet the early years of the war revealed a hidden flaw that infuriated commanders. The magnetic detonators often failed. Designed to trigger beneath a ship's keel, where the explosion would cause maximum damage, they frequently misfired or exploded prematurely. U-boat captains cursed as torpedoes ran under ships without detonating, or worse, circled back toward their own vessels. Engineers scrambled to correct the defects, but for months German submariners fought with unreliable weapons. It was a bitter irony for men risking their lives in the depths, and it was a reminder that technology, however advanced, was never infallible. Central to the U-boat's identity were the two principal designs, the Type 7 and the Type 9. The Type 7, compact and agile, became the workhorse of the fleet, with over 700 constructed during the war. It displaced around 760 tons, carried 14 torpedoes, and could patrol for weeks before returning to base. With a surface range of nearly 8,500 nautical miles, it was perfectly suited to the North Atlantic battleground. Its small size made it harder to detect, and its maneuverability gave commanders confidence in close-range attacks. The Type 9, by contrast, was larger and built for long-range operations, capable of striking as far as the Caribbean and Indian Ocean. These boats carried more torpedoes, more fuel, and heavier guns, allowing them to hunt in distant waters where convoys once felt secure. Together, these two designs embodied the dual nature of the U-boat war: quick, deadly ambushes near Britain, and far-ranging raids deep into Allied shipping lanes. Each was a masterpiece of German engineering, and each became synonymous with terror on the high seas. For all their power, U-boats relied heavily on their periscopes, fragile instruments that bridged the gulf between steel and sea. Rising just a few feet above the surface, the periscope gave commanders a brief, precious glimpse of the world beyond. Through its narrow lens, a skilled captain could judge bearing, range, and speed, calculating firing solutions with astonishing accuracy. Yet the periscope was also a liability, a telltale ripple that vigilant escorts could spot on calm seas. Using it too long risked detection, using it too little risked missing the target. In heavy seas it was often useless, its lens blurred by spray and foam. Still, it was indispensable, the predator's eye in a vast ocean. Many commanders spoke of the periscope as an extension of themselves, a symbol of both power and vulnerability. In the silent cat and mouse of the Atlantic, it was the hunter's single window to prey, and through it, fortunes were won and lost in seconds. Wolfpack tactics depended on communication, and here technology became both ally and liability. Each U-boat carried a powerful radio transmitter, linking it to Dönitz's headquarters in occupied France. When a convoy was sighted, the boat shadowed it, transmitting signals that summoned others to converge. This coordination allowed packs of up to 20 submarines to form, overwhelming even heavily escorted convoys. The German system of centralized control gave Dönitz remarkable influence, turning scattered boats into a cohesive weapon. Yet every transmission was a risk, a thread that Allied direction-finding stations could follow. Radio waves betrayed positions, and as the war progressed, these signals became a double-edged sword. German engineers encrypted them with Enigma, which seemed unbreakable until it wasn't. In the early years, however, the system gave Wolfpacks terrifying efficiency. It was the nervous system of the U-boat arm, binding hunters across thousands of miles of sea. On the surface, U-boats carried deck guns and anti-aircraft weapons, giving them secondary means of attack and defense. The standard 88 mm deck gun could sink smaller ships without wasting torpedoes, blasting holes until they sank beneath the waves. Crews manned these weapons in bitter Atlantic winds, shells stacked at their feet as spray drenched the deck. Many early victories came this way, especially against unescorted freighters and stragglers. But as convoys grew better defended and air patrols increased, deck guns became liabilities, exposing boats to swift retaliation. By 1943, most U-boats relied solely on torpedoes, surfacing only when forced. Anti-aircraft guns, too, proved of limited use, as Allied aircraft grew faster and deadlier. Still, for the crews, the deck armament represented a sense of control in a war where they were otherwise blind and hunted. The gleam of the barrel on a stormy horizon was both weapon and comfort, and it symbolized the last breath of surface warfare in a war fought beneath the waves. Despite their strengths, U-boats carried deep vulnerabilities that technology could not erase. Their batteries limited submerged endurance, forcing them to surface daily to recharge. On the surface, they were faster, but also exposed to aircraft and radar, their silhouettes stark against the sea. Submerged, they were stealthy but slow, crawling at barely a few knots while their batteries drained. Noise discipline was paramount, as even a dropped wrench could betray their position to sonar. Depth charge attacks exposed their fragility, as the hull groaned and rivets popped under pressure. Each patrol was a constant negotiation with these limitations, balancing stealth, speed, and survival. Commanders learned to exploit darkness, storms, and surprise, turning weakness into advantage. Yet the technology always left them vulnerable, always one mistake from destruction. It was the paradox of the U-boat, powerful enough to terrify, fragile enough to die in silence, and that fragility haunted every crew who sailed beneath the waves. The reliability of U-boat technology often rested in the hands of its crews, men trained to repair under impossible conditions. Torpedomen worked in cramped spaces, handling weapons that could explode if mishandled. Engineers coaxed diesels and electric motors through storms, patching leaks and jury-rigging parts when spares ran out. Electricians monitored batteries that leaked acid fumes, a danger as deadly as enemy fire. Every man became a mechanic, improvising solutions with whatever tools and scrap they had aboard. Failure was not an option, for a single malfunction could strand the boat hundreds of miles from safety. When depth charges burst nearby, damage control became a frantic ballet of sealing leaks, checking gauges, and praying the pumps held. Many U-boats survived only because their crews were resourceful, stubborn, and unyielding. Their machines were unforgiving masters, demanding constant vigilance, and the men rose to the challenge again and again. Ultimately, the technology of the U-boat arm was both its strength and its Achilles heel. The boats were marvels of engineering, deadly hunters that changed the shape of naval warfare. Their torpedoes, their periscopes, their radios all gave them the tools to threaten an empire. Yet each advantage carried flaws, vulnerabilities the Allies would slowly learn to exploit. Magnetic detonators betrayed them, radios exposed them, and their fragile hulls limited their endurance. Dönitz believed in them utterly, convinced they could strangle Britain into submission. For a time the Atlantic seemed to bend to their will, convoys burning under the cold stars. But the contest was never static, and the Allies were adapting with relentless speed. Technology had given the U-boats their edge, but it would also seal their fate. In the Atlantic War, machines were never perfect, only temporary masters of the sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was never fought solely with steel and torpedoes. It was also waged in the ether, across invisible waves of radio transmission. Every time a U-boat reported its position, requested instructions, or relayed a convoy sighting, it sent signals into the air. German commanders relied on these transmissions to coordinate Wolfpacks, binding scattered submarines into cohesive hunting groups. But what the Germans saw as strength became, in time, a vulnerability. Allied listening posts, known as Y stations, dotted the coastlines of Britain and beyond, their antennas tuned to intercept these messages. Operators worked tirelessly, with headphones pressed to ears, scribbling down encrypted signals in endless streams of numbers and letters. To them, the crackle of static was the sound of an unseen battlefield stretching across the sea. Each intercepted message was passed to analysts, who sought to locate, decode, and exploit the enemy's words. This invisible war of listening and guessing became as vital as convoys and escorts, and in its silence, the first foundations of victory were laid. At the heart of this effort was HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, nicknamed HFDUF. This technology allowed Allied operators to triangulate the origin of German transmissions, pinpointing U-boat positions with surprising accuracy. When a submarine sent a signal, even a brief one, it left a trace in the ether that could be hunted. Multiple stations would take bearings, and where the lines intersected, a target was revealed. Escort ships at sea carried portable versions, giving commanders the ability to chase down radio sources mid-patrol. For U-boat captains, who believed their coded messages were invulnerable, this was a hidden danger they rarely suspected. To Allied escorts, HFDUF was a lifeline, offering a rare glimpse into the shadows. Combined with convoy intelligence, it gave warning of ambushes before torpedoes struck. It was a cat-and-mouse game, fought not with guns but with dials, headphones, and disciplined patience, and it turned invisible radio signals into deadly leads. Yet while direction finding revealed where the U-boats were, the greater challenge lay in breaking what they said. Every German naval message was encrypted, using the Enigma machine, a device of rotors, wires, and lamps that scrambled letters into endless variations. To the Germans, Enigma was unbreakable, its daily changing keys making brute force attacks impossible. But they underestimated the determination of their enemies, and the story of Enigma's unraveling began not in Britain but in Poland. In the 1930s, Polish mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różicki, and Henryk Zygalski began to study intercepted German signals. Using mathematical analysis and mechanical aids, they reconstructed the wiring of the Enigma machine and devised methods to crack its codes. Their work was revolutionary, proving that Enigma was not invincible, but vulnerable to methodical logic. On the eve of war in 1939, they shared their findings with Britain and France, handing over precious knowledge and replica machines. It was a gift that would change the course of the Atlantic War, and it planted the seeds of Bletchley Park's future triumphs. Early British cryptanalytic efforts built upon this Polish foundation, but the task remained staggering. The Germans continually improved their systems, adding rotors and plugboard settings to multiply possible combinations. Each new layer of complexity meant more work for the cryptanalysts, whose task seemed Sisyphean in scope. Yet Britain gathered some of its brightest minds at Bletchley Park, a quiet country estate turned into the beating heart of code-breaking. Mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions joined forces, each bringing unique skills to the puzzle. They sifted through mountains of intercepts, searching for patterns, repetitions, or careless errors by German operators. Progress was slow, but even partial decrypts gave glimpses of convoy orders, U-boat patrol zones, and supply arrangements. Each success was a lifeline, turning random numbers into actionable intelligence. The work demanded secrecy, speed, and relentless creativity. And it was here that the invisible battle for the Atlantic began to tip. For the U-boat commanders, unaware of these breakthroughs, radio remained both their sword and shield. They trusted Enigma absolutely, convinced its complexity guaranteed safety. Dönitz demanded constant communication, issuing orders, receiving reports, and directing Wolfpacks in real time. This reliance produced devastating effectiveness in the early years, as convoys were struck with uncanny coordination. But the same signals that bound his wolves also betrayed their movements to watchful ears. Every intercepted transmission added to the Allied mosaic, building a clearer picture of the submarine war. The Germans never suspected their own lifeline was also their vulnerability, and as Bletchley Park grew in capability, each radio signal became both weapon and liability. It was a paradox that defined the intelligence war, and it would ultimately shape the outcome of the Atlantic struggle. The struggle for intelligence was not confined to laboratories and estates, but stretched into the field. Y-station operators, often women working long hours in isolated huts, intercepted signals in real time. Their concentration was relentless, as even a few missed letters could render a message indecipherable. Couriers rushed these intercepts to cryptanalysts, who pored over them with pencils, typewriters, and logic machines. Every layer of effort depended on countless unseen hands, each contributing to the fragile chain of intelligence. Mistakes could cost convoys lives, but success could save thousands of tons of shipping. In this way, ordinary people far from the front lines became warriors in the unseen war. Their battleground was the airwaves, their weapons were pens and patience, and their victories were measured not in explosions but in ships arriving safely at port. The intelligence war was as human as it was mathematical, and it demanded sacrifice no less than the fighting at sea. By late 1940 and into 1941, the Allies were still far from mastery, but they had begun to glimpse the possibilities. Direction finding combined with partial decrypts gave convoys chances to evade Wolfpacks, reducing losses on some crossings. The victories were not dramatic, but they hinted at a turning tide. Convoy commanders gained confidence, Knowing they were no longer entirely blind, merchant sailors, though still terrified, began to feel the benefit of better escort coordination. Losses remained high, but the intelligence war was beginning to erode the German advantage. Each decoded message represented a tiny triumph of logic over secrecy, of patience over arrogance. The battle was still brutal, still uncertain, but the balance had shifted ever so slightly, and behind the scenes, the real war of attrition had already begun. It was a war fought in silence, but its consequences thundered across the Atlantic. The intelligence war was never static, but a living contest of adaptation between hunter and hunted. The Germans tightened procedures, rotated codes, and introduced new machines, trying to stay ahead of their enemies. The Allies responded with new methods, machines, and insights, each side locked in a duel of minds. It was not a battle of explosions, but of ideas, where victory was measured in avoided sinkings and convoys delivered. The foundations laid in these early years would blossom into full-scale advantage later, when ultra-intelligence guided escorts with uncanny precision. But even here, in 1940 and 1941, the outlines were clear. The Atlantic was not only a battlefield of ships and submarines, but of signals and secrets. The war was as much about listening as it was about firing. And in that listening, the first faint notes of victory were heard. The intelligence war had begun, and it would not cease until the last wolf was silenced. Bletchley Park was no grand fortress, but a quiet country estate, its manor house surrounded by hastily built huts. Yet behind those wooden walls, the fate of Britain's survival was slowly being rewritten. Each day, mountains of intercepted German messages arrived, scribbled in streams of letters that seemed meaningless. The task was monumental: turn chaos into clarity, and do it faster than convoys could be sunk. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the rattle of typewriters, and the quiet murmur of analysts at work. The staff ranged from dons of Oxford and Cambridge to young women recruited for their skill with languages and logic. Here mathematicians rubbed shoulders with chess players, linguists and eccentric geniuses, bound by secrecy and duty. At first their progress was slow, the complexity of Enigma, a wall that seemed impossible to breach daily, but slowly, methodically, cracks began to appear, and Bletchley Park became the nerve center of the Atlantic intelligence war. A breakthrough came not from genius alone, but from daring at sea. In 1941, British destroyers captured U-boat crews and their vessels, seizing codebooks, cipher tables, and Enigma components. These daring boardings often occurred amid battle, sailors leaping onto burning submarines to snatch intelligence before scuttling charges went off. The documents, soaked in seawater and stained with oil, were priceless treasures to the cryptanalysts. Each codebook shortened the odds, narrowing the astronomical combinations of the Enigma machine. Suddenly, messages that once seemed unbreakable began to yield. This marriage of frontline courage and backroom intellect became a hallmark of the intelligence war. Every captured scrap of German material found new life in Bletchley's hands, and with each success, the fog surrounding U-boat operations thinned. The ocean remained deadly, but it was no longer completely dark. At the center of Bletchley's effort stood Alan Turing, a mathematician whose brilliance defied convention. Turing approached Enigma not as a puzzle of letters, but as a problem of machines. He designed the bomber, a massive electromechanical device that could test thousands of rotor settings in rapid sequence. With drums spinning, wires crackling, and relays clattering, the bomber became the engine that turned chaos into order. Its design drew inspiration from earlier Polish machines, but was expanded with British ingenuity. Turing's genius lay not only in conception, but in persistence. his relentless pursuit of efficiency and shortcuts. Each bomber run consumed hours, but when it stopped, it spat out keys that unlocked the German signals. Suddenly, what once took weeks could be achieved in a single night. The U-boat codes were no longer untouchable, and the balance of power at sea began to shift imperceptibly. Ultra, the code name for decrypted Enigma intelligence, became one of the most guarded secrets of the war. To reveal its existence would be to kill it, for if the Germans suspected, they would change their systems. Thus, Ultra had to be used sparingly, woven into operations in ways that concealed its origins. Convoys were rerouted as if by chance, escorts dispatched as if guided by intuition. Admirals studied decrypted Wolfpack orders, yet issued commands under the guise of ordinary reconnaissance. This secrecy demanded discipline, and it weighed heavily on those who knew the truth. Lives were lost because intelligence could not be revealed without risk of exposure, but lives were saved in far greater numbers, as entire convoys slipped past waiting packs. Ultra was more than a weapon. It was a hidden hand shaping the war, and in its shadows Britain found a new kind of strength. The practical impact of Ultra on the Atlantic War was transformative. Escorts could now hunt submarines with uncanny precision, appearing at just the right place to disrupt an attack. Convoys crossed with fewer losses, their captains unaware that unseen guardians were guiding them. U-boat commanders grew puzzled, sensing their prey was slipping through nets once cast with certainty. Dönitz fumed at inexplicable failures, convinced there must be leaks among his men. In truth, his every order, his every deployment was often read in London within hours. The Wolfpacks were still dangerous, but their invisibility was gone. Each message was a thread pulled from the fabric of German strategy, unraveling the coherence of the hunt. For Britain, Ultra was the lifeline that restored hope when the sea seemed lost. For Germany, it was an unseen enemy gnawing from within, and for the men of Bletchley, it was proof that numbers could sink ships. Life inside Bletchley was grueling, the pressure immense and unrelenting. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, decoding, analyzing, and transmitting intelligence at a pace dictated by survival. Many lived in secrecy, unable to tell friends or family the nature of their work. Fatigue was constant, yet so was the sense of purpose. Young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service operated the bombers, tending machines that clattered day and night. Mathematicians scribbled equations on chalkboards, erasing and rewriting as breakthroughs emerged. Linguists parsed German slang, naval jargon, and abbreviations, turning raw decrypts into usable intelligence. The weight of responsibility hung over them all, for a missed detail could mean a lost convoy. Yet camaraderie grew, fueled by the knowledge that they were fighting a silent war of equal importance to any battlefield. And in their isolation, they forged bonds that lasted lifetimes. The Germans believed Enigma was flawless, its daily key changes making it unbreakable. They could not conceive that mathematics, machines, and human ingenuity would pierce its armor even when ships were lost mysteriously or convoys evaded attack. Suspicion rarely fell on the cipher system. This arrogance was Germany's blind spot, and it allowed Ultra to flourish undetected. The Allies carefully guarded this advantage, crafting elaborate deceptions to explain their successes. Reconnaissance flights were staged, patrols intensified, and reports manipulated to conceal the true source. The secrecy held, and with it, the strategic leverage. By the end of 1941, Ultra was providing a steady stream of intelligence on U-boat movements. It was not perfect, and it did not end the threat, but it turned the tide, and it ensured that Britain would not starve. The story of Bletchley Park in the Battle of the Atlantic is one of partnership between bravery and brilliance. Sailors risked lives to capture codebooks. Engineers built machines that devoured ciphers. Analysts transformed fragments into insight. Each link was fragile, yet together they forged a weapon of unparalleled power. The seas remained contested, but Britain no longer faced the abyss alone. Ultra had become the great equalizer, restoring balance in a battle once tilted toward Germany. The men and women of Bletchley Park never fired a torpedo or dropped a depth charge, yet their work destroyed more U-boats than any fleet. Their victory was invisible, measured not in explosions but in ships that reached port safely, and in their silence they rewrote the history of the Atlantic War. For without them the longest battle might have ended in defeat. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 gave Karl Dönitz the opportunity he had long awaited. While the world's eyes were on Pearl Harbor and the Pacific, the Atlantic became his new battlefield of choice. With Britain still struggling to secure its lifeline, America's coastline appeared defenseless, a rich hunting ground. Dönitz launched Operation Polkenschlag, drumbeat dispatching U-boats across the Atlantic to strike the unprepared United States. In January 1942, the first waves of submarines arrived silently off New York, Cape Hatteras, and the Gulf Coast. What they found astonished even hardened commanders: merchant ships steaming independently, lights blazing against city skylines. Navigating at night was effortless, for the glow of American towns lit silhouettes of tankers and freighters like targets on a firing range. Torpedoes found their marks with horrifying regularity, detonating within sight of beachgoers. Flames from oil tankers lit the horizon, turning the ocean into a funeral pyre. The second happy time had begun, and the Atlantic burned anew. U-boat captains spoke with awe of the ease with which they struck America's coast. Commanders like Reinhard Hardigan of U-123 recorded scenes almost surreal in their vulnerability. On patrol off New York, he found ship after ship sailing without blackout, their navigation lights bright, as if war had not touched the continent. Hardigan surfaced boldly, his crew watching the Manhattan skyline, while below decks torpedoes were loaded for attack. Within days, freighters were sinking in full view of astonished civilians on shore. Panic spread as bodies and wreckage washed up on beaches once filled with vacationers. The U-boats had brought total war to American soil in a way Pearl Harbor had only foreshadowed. For the submariners, it was almost too easy, a grotesque shooting gallery with no resistance. Dönitz's wolves reveled in their newfound reach, and in the early months of 1942, American waters became their killing ground. The geography of the American East Coast only magnified the slaughter. Cape Hatteras, known as the graveyard of the Atlantic even in peacetime, became a death trap for tankers. Shallow waters funneled shipping into predictable lanes, making ambushes almost effortless. Oil tankers bound from Texas and the Caribbean carried vital fuel, their holds brimming with flammable cargo. One torpedo was enough to transform them into infernos, towering flames marking their demise for miles. Smoke plumes rose into the sky by day, guiding U-boats to new victims by night. Fishermen reported seas coated with oil, while beachgoers watched in horror as tankers burned offshore. The destruction was relentless, with dozens of ships sunk in a matter of weeks. American ports felt the squeeze as fuel shortages loomed, and the coast became a theater of fire, visible from boardwalks and city streets alike. The U.S. Navy was caught disastrously unprepared for this onslaught, focused on rebuilding after Pearl Harbor, and stretched thin across two oceans. It lacked escorts, aircraft, and doctrine for coastal defense. Convoy systems, long proven effective by the British, were not immediately adopted by American commanders. Instead, ships were ordered to sail individually, believing speed and dispersion offered safety. The result was catastrophe, as isolated vessels became easy prey for experienced U-boat hunters. Radar coverage was poor, patrol aircraft few, and coastal lights often left burning, silhouetting ships against shorelines. While British officers begged their allies to implement convoy systems, bureaucratic hesitation delayed action. In those crucial first months, hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping were lost. German captains marveled at their good fortune, some even calling it the happy time of America, and every night the Atlantic seemed to mock American unpreparedness. For civilians along the eastern seaboard, the war arrived in flames and wreckage. Residents of Cape Hatteras and New Jersey watched burning tankers from their porches, their glow illuminating beaches for miles. Wreckage and oil washed ashore, along with lifeboats filled with shivering survivors. Newspapers carried grim photographs of corpses on American beaches, a shocking contrast to propaganda of distant war. Rumors spread of U-boats surfacing to shell towns, though these were rare and often exaggerated. Still, the fear was real, for people could see the destruction with their own eyes. Civilians organized blackout drills, while Coast Guard patrols scoured harbors for saboteurs. Panic coexisted with fascination, for many Americans had never imagined war so close. The ocean, once a barrier of safety, had become a highway for death, and the U-boats thrived in its shadows. The success of the Second Happy Time owed as much to German audacity as to American complacency. Dönitz had sent only a handful of submarines at first, but they sank ships faster than replacements could be built. Each patrol brought reports of extraordinary hauls: convoys ambushed, tankers destroyed, merchantmen scattered. Commanders radioed jubilant messages back to France, their victories celebrated in German propaganda. The Reich painted the campaign as proof of naval supremacy, a humiliation for the United States. Yet behind the triumphs lay the same risks that haunted every patrol. Escorts grew bolder, depth charges more accurate, and the long journey across the Atlantic stretched U-boats to their limits. Still, for several months the balance favored the hunters. The Atlantic once again belonged to the Grey Wolves, and the Allies were forced to confront the cost of delay. Eventually, American defenses adapted, though painfully late. By mid-1942, convoy systems were finally implemented along the eastern seaboard, reducing the carnage. Blackout regulations dimmed coastal lights, denying U-boats their easy silhouettes. Escort ships and aircraft increased, forcing submarines to retreat farther offshore. Radar and sonar coverage improved, closing the gap in detection. Losses, while still heavy, began to level off as the element of surprise faded. The U-boats had inflicted staggering damage, but their window of advantage was closing. For the Allies, the lesson was costly but clear: negligence could kill as surely as torpedoes. And for the Germans, the brief American happy time was a golden hour never to be repeated. The tide was shifting again, slowly but inexorably, and the hunters would soon find themselves hunted in turn. The Second Happy Time revealed the global nature of the Battle of the Atlantic. No coast, however distant, was immune from the reach of submarines. The U-boats had shown that war could touch even the streets of New York and the beaches of Florida. Their attacks shocked America into urgency, knitting the Atlantic alliance closer. They also stretched German resources, for every boat sent west was one less guarding Europe. The campaign was both triumph and trap, a fleeting blaze of victory that sowed seeds of future defeat. For while America reeled in early 1942, It also learned and hardened, adapting with speed once the cost was clear. The convoys grew stronger, the escorts more deadly, the skies more watchful. The flames off Cape Hatteras lit not only wreckage but also resolve, and the menace that spread so easily would soon meet its reckoning. The catastrophe of the Second Happy Time forced the Allies, especially the Americans, to face hard truths. Independent sailings had proven suicidal, and the old arrogance that the Atlantic was too wide to be threatened collapsed in smoke and oil. Under British pressure and bitter necessity, the US Navy introduced convoy systems along its coasts in mid-1942. Merchant ships no longer steamed alone, but grouped into formations, shepherded by destroyers, corvettes, and Coast Guard cutters. The difference was immediate. While convoys still suffered losses, the slaughter of scattered vessels diminished sharply. Escorts, once too few, now grew more numerous, armed not only with depth charges, but with radar and sonar. Communication between escorts improved, creating a screen that was fluid, aggressive, and alert. The convoys became moving fortresses, shifting from prey to defended targets. U-boats could still strike, but their work grew bloodier and more dangerous. And the first signs of the hunters becoming the hunted began to emerge. Technology became the silent ally that shifted the balance at sea. Radar sets, once primitive, grew more reliable and compact, allowing escorts to detect submarines on the surface even in darkness and fog. What had once been a cloak of night for U-boat captains became a stage of peril, where their silhouettes betrayed them long before they fired. Sonar, known as ADSIC, improved in accuracy, sending pings into the depths that echoed back submarine positions. Escorts learned to work in packs of their own, triangulating contacts, hounding U-boats with relentless charges. Lee lights, mounted on patrol aircraft, turned surprise into terror for the submariners. Flying silently at night, aircraft could approach unseen, then flood the sea with blinding light, freezing U-boats on the surface seconds before bombs or depth charges fell. No longer could captains surface with impunity to recharge batteries under cover of darkness. The ocean's protective cloak was being torn away, and with it the U-boat's dominance began to fray. The air war over the Atlantic became as decisive as the battles at sea. Long-range patrol aircraft, once scarce, multiplied as America's industrial might came into play. Liberators, Catalinas, and Sunderland stretched their patrol arcs into the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap, once a sanctuary for submarines. No longer could Wolfpacks linger undisturbed in the middle of the ocean, waiting for convoys. Now they faced sudden attacks from the sky, their decks raked with machine gun fire and bombs. Escort carriers joined the fight, small converted ships that carried a handful of aircraft but projected power far into open waters. They shadowed convoys, launching patrols at dawn and dusk when U-boats were most vulnerable. Sailors who once cursed the empty skies now cheered as fighters roared overhead. The convoy and the carrier had fused into a floating fortress of steel and air, and the ocean grew less lonely, less dark, and less forgiving to the wolves below. Each convoy battle became a laboratory of adaptation, with lessons learned in fire and fear. Escorts no longer reacted passively to torpedo strikes, but surged toward periscope flashes, hurling depth charges in aggressive counterattacks. Hedgehog mortars, firing patterns of contact-fused bombs, added new teeth to the hunt, exploding only upon impact with steel hulls. Coordination grew tighter, with escort groups developing doctrines for pursuit, coverage, and rotation. Destroyer captains spoke of the thrill of the chase, the sudden ping of sonar leading to a kill, confirmed by oil and wreckage rising from below. The convoy system, once seen as cumbersome, revealed its true power in these engagements. Instead of isolated tragedies, battles became contests of endurance, where escorts could bleed U-boats dry. Each attack sharpened Allied tactics, each defense hardened resolve. Losses remained high, but the curve was bending, and in those subtle shifts, the seeds of victory took root. Behind the technology stood the human element, men and women learning, improvising, and enduring. Escort sailors lived on cramped destroyers, weeks at sea in rolling storms, nerves frayed by endless vigilance. Sonar operators strained to distinguish echoes from whales or debris, their headphones pressed tight, every sound a possible enemy. Radar operators scanned flickering screens for blips that might be submarines, fishing boats, or illusions. Air crews flew endless patrols over empty oceans, scanning waves until their eyes burned, rewarded sometimes with a sudden periscope glint. Engineers maintained fragile electronics under brutal conditions, salt air corroding circuits, storms shaking equipment to pieces. Each success was born of exhaustion, persistence, and discipline. Technology gave tools, but people turned them into weapons. Their labor was invisible compared to the glamour of battleships and carriers. Yet without them, the convoys would have perished, and the battle would have been lost. For the Germans, this transformation was a creeping nightmare. Dönitz's wolves, once supreme, found their hunting grounds shrinking, their risks multiplying. Messages from captains told of constant air patrols, sonar that never seemed to lose them, and depth charges that rained without end. The nights once safe had turned hostile, filled with searchlights and radar beams. Surfacing to recharge became a gamble, often ending in sudden attacks that left boats crippled or destroyed. Morale began to waver as crews realized they were no longer invisible hunters, but hunted prey. Even the most skilled commanders found themselves cornered, unable to match the growing Allied shield. Technology had shifted the balance, and with it, the tempo of war. The seas that once belonged to Germany were slipping away, and every month the cost in boats and men grew heavier. The integration of these tools into strategy marked a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time in history, ships, planes, and machines fused into a single defensive web, covering convoys across thousands of miles. Information flowed faster, from radar blips to decrypted signals, turning scattered data into decisive action. Convoy escorts no longer groped blindly, but acted with foresight, anticipating attacks before they came. The combination of convoy grouping, air patrols, radar, sonar, and improved weaponry created a layered defense. Each layer bought precious time, reducing sinkings and saving lives. The Germans, who had thrived on surprise, now faced a system designed to deny them that advantage. The hunter's freedom of maneuver was gone, replaced by a gauntlet of risk. Every attack came with higher odds of retaliation, every victory with a price. The Atlantic had become a chessboard, and the Allies had finally learned the rules. And with each passing month, they played the game better. By late 1942 and into 1943, the transformation was undeniable. Convoys that had once limped into port now arrived with more ships intact, their escorts bloodied but triumphant. U-boat sinkings began to rise, outpacing new construction, a trend that would spell disaster for Dönitz's arm. The shift was not sudden, not a single battle or invention, but a grinding evolution of defense. Radar, sonar, aircraft, and escort carriers had combined into a shield that blunted the Wolfpacks' fangs. Sailors whispered that the tide had turned, though the struggle was far from over. Britain no longer starved, America no longer reeled, and the Atlantic lifeline no longer seemed doomed. The battle remained the longest, but its direction was changing. The Allies had adapted, and with adaptation came resilience, and resilience would carry them to victory. The convoys were not made of steel alone, but of men, most of them civilians drawn into a war they never sought. Merchant sailors, crewed tankers, freighters and liners that carried food, fuel and weapons across oceans ruled by predators. Their ships were slow, often unarmed or lightly defended, plodding along at speeds barely faster than a surfaced U-boat. Every voyage was a gamble, for the men knew they sailed not with the Navy's protection but in its shadow. They faced the same storms, the same bitter cold, but with none of the discipline or training of professional warships. Yet their task was no less vital, for without them armies starved and factories fell silent. They endured because they had no choice, their lives caught in the gears of total war. Some were veterans of the sea, hardened sailors who knew every wave by name. Others were teenagers, barely out of school, lured by pay or pressed by duty. All shared the knowledge that a torpedo could end them in seconds. Life aboard a merchant vessel in Convoy was a mixture of monotony and terror. Days passed in routines of watches, maintenance, and endless horizon, broken only by coded signals and the occasional escort ship flashing by. Meals were sparse, often tinned and cold, served in mess halls that smelled of diesel and sweat. Sleep was fitful, disturbed by the thrum of engines and the fear of sudden alarms. At night, blackout curtains sealed every porthole, but sailors knew the U-boats were out there, listening, hunting. Some played cards to distract themselves, others wrote letters they might never send. Rumors swept the decks, whispers of ships sunk in other convoys, of survivors freezing in rafts. Every man calculated odds in his own way, wondering if his ship was next. The ocean was endless, the silence deceptive, and fear was a constant companion, for the convoy was both shield and target. When an attack came, it was sudden, brutal, and unforgettable. A torpedo strike ripped through steel with a thunderous crack, throwing men from bunks and scattering cargo like matchsticks. Fire erupted in seconds, fueled by oil or munitions, while freezing seawater rushed into compartments. The ship listed, alarms wailed, and orders were shouted through chaos as sailors scrambled for lifeboats. In the blackness of night, panic mingled with discipline, for men knew survival depended on speed. Many never made it, trapped below decks or consumed by flames. Those who reached the surface faced seas ablaze with burning fuel, their raft surrounded by screams. Cold Atlantic water stole life in minutes, numbing limbs and crushing hope. To witness comrades vanish into the dark was a wound that never healed, and every survivor carried those memories forever. Stories of survival emerged from these ordeals, tales of courage amid catastrophe. Sailors clung to rafts for days, lashed by storms, drinking rainwater and rationing crumbs of food. Some drifted for weeks, rescued by passing ships or aircraft, their skin blistered by salt and sun. Others froze within hours, their bodies stiffened by the merciless Atlantic chill. One convoy survivor recalled watching his tanker explode, its deck torn apart in a sheet of flame that lit the night like dawn. Another described the eerie silence after a sinking, when cries faded and only waves remained. Rescue was never certain, for escorts pursued the attackers instead of stopping to aid survivors. Men learned to accept that they might be abandoned, sacrificed for the greater convoy. It was a grim calculus, understood but never forgiven, and it hardened them into men of extraordinary resilience. Yet bravery was not only measured in survival, but in the choice to sail again. Many merchant sailors, once rescued, returned to sea, despite their trauma, compelled by duty or necessity. They knew each voyage could be their last, but they also knew the war could not be won without them. Civilian crews became unsung heroes, their contribution equal to that of soldiers in trenches or pilots in cockpits. Their names rarely made headlines, but their sacrifice kept nations alive. Pay was meager, recognition fleeting, yet their endurance was monumental. Some earned medals, others went unnoticed, but all shared the same peril. In ports, families watched them depart, uncertain if they would return. Each farewell was a gamble with fate, and every return was a victory over death. Conditions aboard these ships compounded the ordeal. Heat below decks was stifling, air foul with fumes from engines and cargo, rats infested holds, gnawing at supplies, while salt water seeped into bunks and clothing. Hygiene was poor, illness common, and medical aid minimal, with only rudimentary care available at sea. Storms battered the convoys, waves towering higher than the ships themselves, leaving sailors clinging to rails. Ice formed on decks in the winter Atlantic, turning every step into a hazard. Men worked in soaked clothes for weeks, their bodies chilled to the bone. Fatigue eroded morale, but discipline kept them moving. The ocean was their enemy as much as the U-boats, and the battle for survival was fought every hour, not only in combat but in endurance. The constant fear of attack gnawed at even the strongest spirits. Sailors grew hypersensitive to sounds, the creak of bulkheads or the echo of distant engines sparking dread. Dreams were haunted by explosions, nightmares indistinguishable from memories. Yet within this fear lay remarkable solidarity, men binding together in trust and reliance. They shared cigarettes, stories, and humor, finding small ways to defy despair. Chaplains read prayers, captains spoke of duty, and sailors clung to the belief that fate had not yet chosen them. Hope was fragile, but it kept them steady through endless crossings. The convoy was not only a formation of ships, but a community of men bound by survival. Each voyage forged bonds no peacetime could replicate, and in that brotherhood they found strength to face the next crossing. The life of merchant sailors in the convoys was one of invisible heroism, lived far from headlines and parades. They endured dangers equal to any battlefield, with no weapons of their own except courage. Their losses were staggering, thousands perishing in icy waters that swallowed bodies and memories alike. Yet they sailed again and again, carrying the war on their backs across hostile seas. The convoys they manned were the arteries of the Allied world, each voyage a gamble that kept nations alive. Their hardships were immense, their sacrifices profound, their resilience unmatched. In the shadow of warships and submarines, they bore the weight of global conflict, and though many were forgotten, history remembers their role as vital. Without them, the Atlantic battle could not have been won, and without them, freedom might never have endured. For all the advances in radar, sonar, and escort tactics, there remained one place where convoys sailed blind, the mid-Atlantic Gap. Sailors called it the Black Pit, a vast stretch of ocean too far from land-based aircraft for protection. Here, convoys entered a deadly silence, knowing that no friendly patrol plane would appear overhead. For the U-boats, this void was a hunting ground without interference, their periscopes and hydrophones the only eyes needed. Night after night, Wolfpacks converged in the darkness, their radios buzzing with orders from France. Merchant sailors dreaded this passage more than any other, their nerves stretched thin as they waited for the inevitable. The escorts did their best, but numbers were often too few, their screens stretched to breaking. When torpedoes struck in the gap, rescue was slower, retaliation less certain, and survival slim. It was here, in this dark heart of the Atlantic, that some of the fiercest convoy battles of the war unfolded, and it was here that the outcome of the longest battle was decided. Convoy SC-118 in February 1943 became a symbol of the Black Pit's horrors. Bound for Britain with 63 merchant ships, it faced relentless attacks from Wolfpacks shadowing it for days. The convoy's escorts fought with courage, their depth charges hammering the sea, but the Germans pressed from all sides. In a week of fighting, 11 ships were sunk, their cargoes and crews lost to the icy Atlantic. Survivors told of burning tankers lighting the night and explosions that shook the sea like earthquakes. Escort commanders worked without sleep, chasing sonar contacts, rallying stragglers, and forcing their exhausted men to keep fighting. On board the merchant ships, sailors prayed with each torpedo wake that they would not be next. Even so, the convoy reached Britain, bloodied but not broken, proof of endurance against impossible odds. For the Allies, South Carolina 118 was a reminder of how fragile victory still was. For the Germans, it was evidence that the Black Pit remained their deadliest weapon. The battle for Convoy on S5 in May 1943 was a turning point, a clash that showed both the ferocity and futility of the Wolfpacks. With 43 merchant ships bound westward from Liverpool, ONS-5 was heavily attacked by a force of over 40 U-boats. The fighting stretched across a week, marked by storms, chaos, and savage determination on both sides. Escorts and U-boats clashed in night battles where flares lit the sea and explosions echoed for miles. 13 merchantmen were lost, their crews scattered into freezing waters that claimed many before rescue arrived, but the Wolfpacks suffered too, hammered by depth charges and hunted by escorts who refused to yield. In the end, 7 U-boats were destroyed, a loss that stunned Dönitz's command. The battle was bloody, indecisive in appearance, yet symbolically profound. It showed that the Wolfpacks could bleed as well as bite, and it marked the beginning of their decline. Convoy HX-229, paired with SC-122 in March 1943, represented the height of the U-boat threat. Together, the convoys carried nearly 100 merchant ships, a vast armada crossing the Black Pit. The Germans, reading convoy signals through their still secure Enigma channels, sent multiple Wolfpacks to intercept. Over 4 days, chaos erupted as U-boats tore into the formations, striking by night and day. 22 merchant ships were sunk, an appalling loss that sent shockwaves through Allied command. Survivors spoke of decks aflame, hulls breaking, and lifeboats capsized in storms. Escorts fought back valiantly, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, their depth charges expended in desperate barrages. The Atlantic seemed, in those days, on the brink of collapse, with Britain's survival once again in question. The U-boats had proven that even in 1943, they could still devastate convoys. But the ferocity of these battles also revealed the intensity of the Allies' resistance, and soon the tide would begin to turn. The human stories of the Black Pit were as harrowing as the statistics. Survivors described the terror of waiting in lifeboats, surrounded by wreckage, hearing the hiss of torpedoes striking other ships. Men froze to death in hours, their bodies stiffened by the cold, while comrades drifted beside them, unable to help. On escort ships, sailors stood watch for days without sleep, the strain carving lines into young faces. The air stank of oil, cordite, and salt, the sea littered with cargo that would never reach its destination. For many, the most haunting memory was not the explosions, but the silence afterward, when cries faded into endless waves. The convoy became a crucible of endurance, forging courage and despair in equal measure. Civilians became veterans, teenagers became hardened men, and grief was carried silently across oceans. Each battle left scars, not only on ships but on spirits, and the Atlantic became a graveyard that remembered every name. For Dönitz, the Black Pit was proof of doctrine, the ultimate justification of Wolfpack tactics. He believed the gap offered Germany the decisive chance to starve Britain into submission. Reports of sinkings bolstered his argument for more submarines, even as losses began to mount. German propaganda celebrated these victories, presenting the U-boat arm as invincible hunters of the deep. Yet beneath the triumph lay unease, for each battle was bloodier, each patrol riskier. Allied escorts, though battered, were not breaking but adapting, sharpening their weapons and coordination. The Wolfpacks had inflicted staggering losses, but they had not forced Britain to her knees. The gap was no longer an unchallenged killing ground, but a battlefield contested at growing cost. And that cost was slowly tilting against Germany. The hunters were beginning to feel hunted themselves. For the Allies, the Black Pit was a nightmare, but one they refused to surrender to. Technological advances crept ever closer, with longer-range aircraft and escort carriers beginning to close the gap. Intelligence from Bletchley Park added subtle advantages, guiding convoys around ambushes and toward reinforcements. Escort commanders grew more skilled, working together in aggressive counterattacks that stunned U-boat crews. Each convoy that survived became a testament to resilience. Each ship delivered a victory against despair. The convoys became symbols of Allied endurance, carrying not only cargo but morale itself. Losses were mourned, but resolve hardened with every crossing, and the men who braved the Black Pit knew they were part of history's longest and most brutal struggle. In their endurance lay the seeds of triumph, and in their courage the Atlantic War was slowly being won. By the spring of 1943, the battles of the Mid-Atlantic Gap reached their climax. The convoys still suffered terribly, but the balance was beginning to tilt with unmistakable force. Escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and improved tactics finally began to pierce the darkness of the Black Pit. U-boat losses climbed sharply, each patrol exacting a heavier toll from Dönitz's arm. The great convoy battles of SC-118, HX-229, and ONS-5 became symbols of both sacrifice and transformation. The Black Pit had been the wolves' hunting ground, but now it became their graveyard. The convoys, bloodied yet unbroken, endured the worst the Atlantic could offer, and their survival marked the moment when the tide of war shifted. From then on, the wolves were no longer the masters of the sea. They were prey in an ocean that was closing against them. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic War had entered a new and decisive phase. Escort groups, once thinly stretched, were now better organized and equipped for the struggle. The Royal Canadian Navy, whose sailors had grown from novices to veterans, fielded the 5th and 7th escort groups with rising confidence. These groups were no longer content to merely defend convoys. They hunted U-boats with relentless aggression. Their corvettes and destroyers swept the seas, working in disciplined formations that maximized their weapons. Depth charges were no longer scattered blindly, but delivered with precision, guided by sharper sonar contacts. The ocean, once dominated by Wolfpacks, now resounded with the methodical hammer of Allied attacks. German commanders began to note that what had been easy prey was now armed and dangerous. The hunted convoys had turned into traps for the hunters, and the change was written in steel, fire, and sinking tonnage. Support groups added a new layer of defense to the Allied arsenal. Unlike convoy escorts tied to merchantmen, these groups roamed free, racing to reinforce convoys under attack. They were fast, flexible, and commanded by officers trained to take risks that once seemed reckless. Their mission was not merely to defend but to destroy, and their presence tilted battles in dramatic ways. When Wolfpacks closed in, support groups appeared like avenging phantoms, driving straight into the melee. They cut through U-boat formations, hammering one contact after another with coordinated runs. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy embraced this offensive posture with increasing skill. Sailors who had once braced for attack now spoke of hunting submarines with a grim satisfaction. The sea itself seemed to shift, no longer the dark hunting ground of the wolves. It was becoming the killing field of the hunters themselves. Technology, too, was rewriting the balance of power in 1943. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing spigot mortar, allowed escorts to fire patterns of explosives ahead of their bows. Unlike depth charges which detonated at set depths, Hedgehog bombs exploded only on contact, signaling a confirmed strike. This innovation ended the guessing game and gave escorts a deadly new precision weapon. Improved radar now pierced the night and fog, spotting periscopes and conning towers at ranges once unimaginable. Long-range aircraft, from Liberators to Sunderlands, finally closed the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap. With lee lights blazing at night, aircraft swooped on submarines caught on the surface, their crews panicked and scrambling for crash dives. U-boats could no longer surface freely to recharge batteries or signal headquarters without risking sudden death from the sky. The technological net was tightening, squeezing the submarine as once safe havens, and every improvement magnified the peril of a U-boat patrol. Convoy battles in spring 1943 revealed this transformation with brutal clarity. In March, Convoy SC-122 and HX-229 had bled terribly, but the lessons of those losses hardened Allied resolve. By April, when Wolfpacks descended again, the outcome was startlingly different. Escorts fought with a ferocity born of experience, their hedgehogs and depth charges slamming home. Aircraft, vectored by improved HF/DF and radar, swooped in to harry retreating U-boats. In some battles, convoys lost only a handful of ships while multiple submarines went down. For the first time, the balance sheet of losses tilted against Dönitz's command. The ocean that had once yielded easy victories was becoming a graveyard for his crews, and in that reversal lay the beginning of Germany's defeat at sea. The destruction of U-boats in these battles was staggering. Reports filtered back of submarines caught mid-surface, split apart by bombs and depth charges. Survivors, if they reached the surface at all, were plucked from oil-slick waters by the very men they had tried to kill. For Allied sailors, it was a grim vindication of years of fear and loss. Escort commanders pressed harder than ever, sometimes chasing single contacts for hours until their prey was finished. Submarines that escaped one attack found themselves hunted again within days. Dönitz's men spoke of patrols that felt like suicide missions, the odds stacked against them from the moment they sailed. The once proud U-boat arm, cornerstone of Germany's naval hopes, was bleeding faster than it could be replaced. By May, the losses became catastrophic, shaking the very foundations of German strategy. The wolves had finally lost their dominance. For the men aboard the U-boats, the change was felt in every dive and surfacing. Patrols grew shorter, their success rates dwindling while dangers multiplied. Each time they surfaced to recharge, they feared the sudden roar of an aircraft overhead. Each sonar ping echoed like a death knell, followed by the thunder of hedgehogs or depth charges. Sleep became fragmented, meals forgotten, and morale cracked under constant pursuit. Once celebrated as heroes, many now felt abandoned, sent to sea as targets rather than hunters. Letters home grew more somber, filled with doubt about the war's outcome. Even the most loyal officers began to question whether Dönitz's faith in U-boat supremacy was misplaced. The pride of the Grey Wolves was giving way to despair, and their steel coffins were becoming their graves with terrifying regularity. The strategic implications were enormous. Britain's lifeline, once fraying, was finally being secured by escort groups, technology and intelligence. Supplies flowed more steadily, bolstering Allied armies preparing for future offensives in North Africa and Europe. The convoys carried not just food and fuel, but tanks, aircraft, and the raw material of modern war. Each ship that reached port meant Allied armies could fight another day with strength. American shipyards poured out replacements faster than U-boats could sink them, tipping the arithmetic further against Germany. Dönitz found himself pleading for new weapons and more boats, even as losses crippled his force. The dream of starving Britain into surrender was dead. What remained was the grim necessity of fighting on, despite the odds, and the Atlantic, once Germany's hunting ground, had become their battlefield of attrition. Spring 1943 became the hinge on which the Battle of the Atlantic turned. The U-boats had enjoyed their happy times, their reign of terror across vast seas. But now, Allied tactics, technology, and willpower had caught up, reshaping the battle's landscape. Escort groups, once desperate defenders, had become predators in their own right. Support groups surged in where battles raged, while air patrols closed the final gaps in coverage. German sailors found themselves crushed between sea and sky, their losses mounting beyond recovery. For the Allies, the shift brought relief, but also the sober knowledge of how close defeat had been. Every convoy delivered was a triumph built on sacrifice and adaptation, and by the end of spring 1943, the tide of the Atlantic War had turned irrevocably. The hunters had become the hunted, and the outcome of the Ocean War was no longer in doubt. By May 1943, the U-boat war reached its most dramatic and catastrophic turning point. The Wolfpacks that once roamed the Atlantic with ruthless efficiency now faced an ocean transformed against them. Allied escort groups, bristling with hedgehogs, radar, and aircraft support, patrolled convoys with deadly precision. The once vast mid-Atlantic gap was shrinking as long-range liberators and escort carriers extended their reach. German submariners who surfaced at night found themselves bathed in sudden lee lights, caught like prey in a hunter's snare. Depth charges and bombs rained down relentlessly, leaving submarines crushed or shattered on the seabed. Convoys that might once have lost a dozen ships now fought back and destroyed the attackers. The hunters were being annihilated in their own hunting grounds, and the toll was staggering. Dönitz's once proud fleet of Grey Wolves was bleeding faster than it could be replenished, and May 1943 would forever be remembered as Black May. The scale of the losses defied belief. In that single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed, the highest total of the entire war. Some were sunk by aircraft swooping from the skies, others by destroyers that tracked them with relentless persistence. Wolfpacks thrown against convoys like ONS-5 found themselves slaughtered in running battles across the ocean. Crews were lost in their hundreds, trapped inside hulls collapsing under depth charge barrages. Survivors, when pulled from the sea, described patrols that felt like walking into certain death. For every U-boat sunk, only a handful of merchant ships fell, a ratio that horrified German commanders. The strategic equation had shifted permanently, with losses outpacing new construction at alarming speed. Shipyards in Germany could not match the pace, and trained crews were irreplaceable. The U-boat force once the spearhead of Germany's war effort, was cracking under unbearable strain, and the men aboard them paid the ultimate price. For the Allies, Black May was not just statistics, but vindication. Years of sacrifice and adaptation had culminated in decisive superiority at sea. Escort commanders now carried the initiative, striking out aggressively rather than merely shielding convoys. Radar screens lit up with contacts, sonar men tracked echoes deep below, and aircraft forced U-boats into defensive dives. Convoy losses plummeted, and morale soared as merchant sailors reached port with cargo intact. Admiralties across London, Washington, and Ottawa saw the figures and knew a threshold had been crossed. The dream of strangling Britain into submission had finally been broken, and with it the larger strategic momentum of the Atlantic War shifted irreversibly. No longer were the Allies on the defensive, they were the masters of the sea lanes, and their victory was measured in steel, survival, and hope renewed. For the Germans, Black May was a nightmare that reverberated through the Kriegsmarine. Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack strategy, saw his proud fleet gutted before his eyes. Reports poured into his headquarters of U-boats lost, crews vanished, and missions aborted. Each message confirmed what he had begun to fear: the ocean had become too hostile for his submariners. Yet Dönitz could not simply abandon the campaign, for the U-boat was Germany's only real weapon against Britain's lifeline. The Führer demanded results, but reality offered only failure and mounting death tolls. Officers at sea wrote of despair, their patrol logs filled with frustration and fatalism. Veterans felt the tide of war slipping beyond their control, their confidence drained by constant defeat. Dönitz faced a cruel truth: continuing the fight meant annihilation, but retreat meant admitting defeat. And in May 1943, even he could not deny the inevitable. The psychological toll on the submariners was devastating. Once hailed as heroes of the Reich, they now departed bases under a shadow of doom. In Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, wives and children waved farewell, knowing many would never return. Patrols became shorter, not from success, but from the inability to survive prolonged combat. Submarines limped home, scarred, their crews shaken by relentless pursuit and near misses. Men spoke of claustrophobic dives that lasted for hours as depth charges pounded overhead. Sleep was scarce, and nerves frayed under constant tension, leaving hardened sailors on the brink of collapse. Letters recovered from captured crews revealed doubts about the war's outcome, doubts once unthinkable among the Grey Wolves. Faith in the invincibility of the U-boat arm had shattered, replaced by a grim acceptance of mortality. Black May was not just a military defeat, it was a breaking of spirit, and it left scars on the men who fought beneath the waves. The broader implications for the Atlantic were immense. With the U-boat threat blunted, Allied supply lines became secure in a way not seen since 1939. Merchant ships poured across the Atlantic in increasing numbers, delivering tanks, fuel, and men to Britain. The logistical foundation for Operation Husky in Sicily, and eventually Operation Overlord in Normandy, was laid in those convoys. Each crossing became less a gamble with death and more a steady stream of strength. American industry, pouring out Liberty ships faster than they could be sunk, now had a clear path to sustain the Allied war effort. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the decisive moment had passed. The Germans had lost the initiative and could never regain it. From May 1943 onward, U-boats were no longer predators, but survivors struggling against impossible odds, and the Atlantic was firmly an Allied highway of war. In Germany, the recognition of defeat came reluctantly. Dönitz ordered the withdrawal of Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic, a tacit admission that the campaign had failed. His submarines would henceforth be used in more limited roles, striking where they might still inflict damage. Hitler raged, but there was little alternative. The losses could not continue without destroying the fleet entirely. The decision marked the end of the U-boats as a strategic weapon capable of deciding the war. They would still fight and still kill, but never again in decisive numbers. The great gamble to starve Britain into collapse had been lost. In its place came the bitter necessity of defensive operations and desperate innovations. For the Allies, the ocean was now a bridge of steel linking continents. For the Germans, it had become a graveyard of shattered ambitions. May 1943 was thus the watershed of the Atlantic campaign, a month that redefined the struggle forever. In its beginning, U-boats still prowled with Menace, their commanders confident of victory. In its end, they were retreating, their losses catastrophic, their morale broken. Black May demonstrated that technology, organization, and relentless adaptation could defeat even the most fearsome enemy. The Allies emerged bloodied but ascendant, their convoys no longer prey but lifelines secured. For Germany, it was the moment when the ocean, once an ally, became an unforgiving foe. The tides of war had shifted, and the Atlantic was no longer in doubt. From then on, Allied victory was only a matter of time and endurance. And for the submariners of the Kriegsmarine, Black May was a memory etched in steel, oil, and the cold silence of the deep. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted beyond a balance. It had tipped decisively toward the Allies. Escort carriers, small flat-tops converted from merchant hulls, now accompanied convoys across the ocean. These ships carried a handful of Wildcats and Avengers, but their presence transformed the tactical equation. Aircraft could now patrol hundreds of miles around the convoy, searching for periscopes, conning towers, and U-boats cruising on the surface. Wolfpacks that once approached under cover of night now faced air patrols from dawn to dusk. Pilots trained in anti-submarine warfare attacked without hesitation, dropping depth charges and rockets onto any target they spotted. The seas that once belonged to the wolves had gained wings of steel. Escort carriers became floating shields, projecting power in the most vulnerable waters. For U-boat crews, the ocean had never felt smaller, nor more hostile, and for the convoys, the odds of survival increased with every passing week. Hunter-killer groups emerged as the Allies' most aggressive innovation. Built around escort carriers and fast destroyers, these groups hunted U-boats without being tied to convoys. They roamed the ocean like predators, seeking contact rather than avoiding it. Using radar, sonar, and ultra-intelligence, they turned the tables on the once feared Wolfpacks. Destroyers swept in coordinated runs, depth charges shaking the sea while aircraft circled above to pin U-boats in place. Battles no longer revolved around saving merchantmen. They now focused on exterminating submarines. Each U-boat sunk weakened Dönitz's arm further, eroding morale and experience at a terrifying rate. The groups achieved spectacular results, sinking multiple submarines in single patrols. For sailors, the satisfaction was palpable. For Germans, the terror was crushing. The Atlantic had become not just a defensive struggle, but an offensive hunt. The integration of ultra-intelligence amplified this transformation. At Bletchley Park, codebreakers unraveled Enigma traffic at a pace that kept convoys one step ahead of Wolfpacks. Messages revealing rendezvous points or patrol zones were passed swiftly to Allied naval commands. Convoys were rerouted around danger, and hunter-killer groups were directed toward U-boat concentrations. The coordination between intelligence, ships, and aircraft created a synergy unmatched in naval history. Commanders at sea no longer relied solely on chance. They fought with knowledge that their enemy's secrets were open. German submariners, unaware of the depth of compromise, blamed radar and bad luck for their mounting disasters. Each intercepted signal meant another ambush, another submarine caught in a tightening noose. Intelligence had become as lethal as torpedoes or depth charges. And in this invisible war, the Allies had achieved near-total dominance. The mid-Atlantic gap, once the dreaded Black Pit, was finally closed. Long-range liberators now flew from Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores, their wings spanning the last void of air cover. Convoys that once sailed blind through nights of terror now had constant guardians overhead. Pilots trained to spot wakes and oil slicks prowled the seas, attacking any trace of submarine presence. The days when Wolfpacks could mass undetected in the gap were gone forever. For U-boats, surfacing to recharge batteries became an invitation to destruction. Even submerged, they were hunted by destroyers with sonar and hedgehog mortars, leaving no safe refuge. Survivors spoke of an ocean alive with enemies, every horizon filled with danger. The Black Pit had once been the hunter's domain, but now it was sealed, fortified, and patrolled without mercy. The gap's closure marked the final nail in the coffin of U-boat supremacy. Convoy battles after mid-1943 told the story in numbers as stark as they were devastating. Where once convoys lost dozens of ships, now entire formations reached port with minimal or no losses. U-boat sinkings skyrocketed, often exceeding 10 or more in a single week of operations. Escort commanders grew confident, driving Wolfpacks away before they could even strike. Pilots returned with photographs of burning submarines, proof of Allied mastery of the seas. For the first time, the arithmetic favored the defenders absolutely. Shipyards in the United States launched Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them, overwhelming German efforts. The once feared Atlantic blockade had been broken by numbers, technology, and relentless willpower. And as the supply lines grew secure, the Allied war machine reached its full potential. Victory in Europe would be built upon that secure foundation, and the Battle of the Atlantic had delivered it. For Dönitz and his staff, the situation grew desperate. He pleaded for new technologies, faster boats, snorkels, and advanced torpedoes, but such innovations came too late. The Type 7 and Type 9, once symbols of German innovation, were now outmatched relics. The Allies could locate, track, and destroy them with alarming efficiency. Patrols that had once promised rich hauls now ended with silence, fear, and loss. Even the most decorated commanders found survival uncertain, their reputations no shield against Allied skill. Dönitz himself, promoted to command the Kriegsmarine, understood the futility but fought on out of necessity. He knew Germany could not win, but retreat was politically impossible. The U-boat arm, once the pride of the Reich, had become a graveyard for its young sailors, and their sacrifice could no longer alter the course of the war. For the men at sea, the difference was tangible. Merchant sailors who once sailed in dread now felt cautious optimism with each crossing. The sight of aircraft overhead or escort carriers on the horizon gave them a confidence long absent. Survivors of earlier battles marveled at the transformation, remembering when convoys were little more than floating targets. U-boat crews, by contrast, departed ports in France with dread, knowing few would return. Patrols that had once felt like hunts now felt like executions. The psychological balance had shifted entirely, the ocean spirit bending toward Allied endurance. Civilians, once cannon fodder for submarine ambushes, now carried cargoes that reached their destinations. Each successful convoy meant more tanks in Africa, more aircraft in Britain, more soldiers ready for invasion, and every journey became part of the tide, carrying the Allies toward ultimate victory. By late 1943, the Atlantic had been decisively won in all but name. U-boats would continue to fight, and men would still die, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Allied superiority was consolidated not in a single battle, but in the relentless accumulation of advantage. Escort carriers, hunter-killer groups, ultra-intelligence, and long-range patrol aircraft formed an iron web across the ocean. The wolves that once ruled the seas were now broken, scattered and dying. Britain's survival, once hanging by a thread, was secured beyond reversal. The United States, harnessing its industrial might, poured men and material across the Atlantic without fear, and the convoys became arteries of victory, pulsing with the lifeblood of Allied power. The longest battle was being won not by chance, but by discipline, innovation, and sacrifice. And in its victory, the path to liberation in Europe was made certain. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought not only in steel and strategy, but in flesh and blood. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served aboard German U-boats during the war, more than 36,000 never returned. It was one of the highest casualty rates of any service arm in modern history, with 9 out of 10 submariners perishing at sea. Most died not in decisive clashes, but in claustrophobic darkness as their boats were crushed beneath the waves. Survivors were rare, sometimes only a handful pulled from oil-slick waters after hours of terror. For families back in Germany, the news often came in silence. No bodies, no graves, only a telegram. The Kriegsmarine honored their men as heroes, but grief was private, felt in kitchens and small towns where sons never came home. Veterans described a service where comradeship was forged as much by shared danger as by shared duty, and that danger consumed an entire generation of young sailors. On the Allied side, the toll was equally staggering, though borne differently. The British Merchant Navy lost over 30,000 men, civilians who carried the war on their shoulders with little recognition. They were fishermen, dock workers, and merchant seamen who became the lifeline of Britain. Their ships were slow, lightly armed, and often alone in the vast Atlantic when the wolves struck. Torpedoed tankers burned like floating infernos, while freighters vanished in seconds beneath the waves. Rescue was uncertain, and lifeboats were often found drifting weeks later, their occupants long dead from exposure or thirst. In some convoys, entire families of seafarers were wiped out, fathers and sons who sailed together into eternity. Memorials in Liverpool, London, and Halifax testify to their sacrifice, yet many names are known only to the sea. The bravery of these civilians equaled that of any soldier in uniform, and their loss was the hidden price of victory. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy paid in blood as well. Escorts bore the brunt of protecting convoys, their destroyers and corvettes constantly under threat. Hundreds of warships were lost to torpedoes, mines, and surface raiders. Crews endured the same dangers as the merchant sailors they shielded, leaping into freezing seas when their ships went down. Many never surfaced again, claimed instantly by the icy North Atlantic. Sailors wrote home of endless cold, wet hammocks and the unrelenting strain of watching for periscopes. They carried scars that lasted long after the war, nightmares of depth charges and burning oil never fading. The Canadian Navy, once small and untested, grew into a force of immense sacrifice and endurance. Their ships and men bore heavy losses, but their contribution was pivotal. The ocean tested all who sailed it, and it spared no one. The families of those who fought bore invisible wounds that rarely made headlines. In German towns, Black-clad widows filled church pews, their grief unspoken under the shadow of propaganda. In Britain, women waited by the docks, searching the faces of returning crews for husbands or sons. In Canada and the United States, telegrams arrived in farmhouses and city apartments, delivering the blunt phrase "missing, presumed drowned." Each loss rippled outward, leaving empty chairs at dinner tables and children who would never know their fathers. Many widows joined war industries, keeping the home front alive even as their grief was fresh. The ocean was merciless, and its toll reached far beyond the men who sailed it. The emotional burden of uncertainty, the not knowing if a loved one had survived, was often worse than death itself. For thousands of families, the sea remained an open wound, and it never truly closed. Memorials across nations attempt to capture the scale of this sacrifice. In Hamburg, bronze plaques bear the names of lost U-boat crews, each line a story of courage and futility. In London, the Merchant Navy Memorial at Tower Hill lists over 24,000 names of civilian sailors who never returned. In Halifax, the poignant statues of the Sailors' Memorial look out to sea, eternal sentinels for the fallen. In Canada's small towns, war memorials grew longer each year as young men failed to come home. In Britain, entire coastal communities lost generations of fishermen who had traded nets for convoys. The Atlantic War was a war of attrition not only at sea, but in memory. Every nation that fought left part of itself in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, and those losses became part of a collective grief too vast for words alone. The memorials remind us of lives lived and lives unfinished. The psychological scars on survivors were often deeper than the physical wounds. Submariners who lived through depth charge attacks spoke of nightmares that haunted them for decades. Merchant sailors who drifted in lifeboats remembered the sound of drowning comrades long after peace returned. Escort sailors confessed that the stress of constant vigilance left them unable to sleep even in silence. Survivors of torpedoed ships described guilt at living when friends perished beside them. Many could never return to the sea, their trust in the ocean shattered forever. The Battle of the Atlantic created not just widows and orphans, but men marked by trauma for life. In those scars lay the unseen cost of the longest campaign, and while medals and honors were awarded, many veterans carried their burdens quietly. The human price of victory was written in memory as much as in history. For Germany, the U-boat arm became both a symbol of pride and a cemetery of youth. New recruits continued to volunteer, driven by duty, desperation, or indoctrination, even as survival odds dwindled. Training schools in Kiel and Flensburg sent boys barely out of adolescence into the steel coffins of Type 7 boats. Many did not live to see their 20th birthdays. By 1944, entire graduating classes were lost within months of their first patrol. In Germany's harbors, the sight of U-boats returning fewer and fewer men told its own grim truth. Families clung to hope, but statistics were merciless. The pride of the Kriegsmarine had become a graveyard in slow motion, and in that graveyard lay Germany's gamble for victory at sea. It was a gamble that cost them dearly. The human cost of the Atlantic War can never be measured solely in numbers. It was measured in fear, endurance, sacrifice, and grief that spread across continents. The 36,000 U-boat men who never returned were matched by tens of thousands of Allied sailors and civilians who shared their fate. Each ship sunk was not just tonnage lost, but lives extinguished and futures erased. The Atlantic became a graveyard as vast as the ocean itself, a place where no monument could hold all the names. Yet the memory of their sacrifice lives on, etched into the nations they served. For without their courage, the war could not have been won, nor freedom preserved. The human cost was the highest price paid in the longest battle, and it stands as the truest measure of the Atlantic War's legacy. The ocean, in its silence, remembers them all. By late 1943, the U-boat arm was a shadow of its former power, yet Karl Dönitz refused to concede defeat. He remained convinced that technological innovation could reverse the tide that had turned so brutally against him. In staff meetings, he spoke with the same intensity that had once inspired his captains during the early triumphs. Now, however, his words carried a note of desperation, driven by mounting losses and collapsing morale. The Reich pinned its hopes on new weapons, devices meant to outpace Allied advances in detection and destruction. Among these, the snorkel, a simple yet transformative idea, was introduced to U-boats. It allowed submarines to remain submerged while running their diesel engines, reducing their vulnerability on the surface. German engineers touted it as a game-changer, a way to hide from the radar-equipped aircraft that now dominated the seas. But the snorkel was not the miracle Dönitz needed, and it carried limitations that frustrated crews and commanders alike. The snorkel's promise lay in invisibility, yet its reality was more complex. Early versions were fragile, often breaking in rough seas or jamming when slammed by waves. The intake valve frequently stuck, sending seawater surging into the engine room and nearly drowning men in choking fumes. Diesel exhaust, vented into the boat during prolonged snorkel use, filled the hull with toxic carbon monoxide. Crews endured constant headaches, nausea, and even unconsciousness while submerged for days at a time. Periscopes and radar masts became harder to use in conjunction with the snorkel, reducing the U-boat's tactical awareness. Worse still, Allied radar soon adapted, detecting the thin mast protruding above the water. Instead of restoring stealth, the snorkel only delayed the inevitable by narrowing the margin of survival. Submariners nicknamed it the suffocating tube, a symbol of desperation rather than salvation. And with each patrol, its flaws became glaringly obvious. While the snorkel was being rushed into service, German designers pursued more radical answers to Allied supremacy. The Type XXT Oars U-boat, known as the electroboat, represented a revolutionary leap in submarine warfare. It was conceived not as a modified surface vessel, but as a true submersible, designed to operate underwater for extended periods. With streamlined hulls and massive battery banks, it could reach speeds of 17 knots submerged, faster than most escorts at the time. Its quiet electric motors promised stealth, while advanced torpedo systems could reload in record time. On paper, the Type XXT Oars was decades ahead of its contemporaries, a weapon that might have altered the course of the war. Crews who saw prototypes described them with awe, marveling at their futuristic design. Dönitz believed this was the tool that could once again make the Atlantic Germany's battlefield. But development was slow, sabotage plagued production, and Allied bombers targeted shipyards relentlessly. The electroboat would arrive, but far too late. In parallel, other designs like the smaller Type XXT coastal submarines were introduced. These vessels, fast and maneuverable, were meant to strike Allied shipping in European waters. They carried fewer torpedoes, but could slip close to coastlines where larger boats risked detection. Their speed and agility impressed those who sailed them, offering glimpses of what the future might have held. Yet by the time they appeared in numbers, Allied dominance was overwhelming. Aircraft swarmed the Bay of Biscay, destroyers prowled every approach, and minefields closed off harbors. Even the most advanced submarine could not fight in a world where the enemy controlled the air, sea, and intelligence networks. The Type XXT scored some successes, sinking isolated ships in the war's final months. But these were tactical pinpricks, not strategic blows. The dream of restoring the Wolfpacks had withered into fragments of resistance. Another hope for Dönitz lay in improved weaponry, particularly new torpedo designs. The T5 Zahnkönig acoustic homing torpedo, introduced in 1943, seemed at first like a breakthrough. Instead of relying on straight runs or magnetic triggers, it homed in on the sound of an enemy ship's propellers. U-boat captains hailed it as a weapon that could bypass evasive maneuvers and smash into escorts directly. Early results were dramatic, with several Allied destroyers struck and sunk by the new technology. Panic rippled through escort groups as commanders struggled to counter this unseen threat. Yet the Allies adapted quickly, deploying noise-making decoys called foxes that lured torpedoes harmlessly away. The once feared acoustic torpedo became unreliable, its promise neutralized within months of deployment. Once again, German innovation had been answered by Allied ingenuity, and Dönitz was left searching for another miracle that would never come. The Desperation extended beyond weapons into tactics themselves. Dönitz attempted to reintroduce dispersed Wolfpack operations, hoping to overwhelm convoys with sheer numbers. But the numbers no longer existed, and the coordination that once worked through radio signals now betrayed them to Allied direction finding. Attempts to attack convoys head-on often ended with submarines hunted down before they could even fire. Mines were laid in shipping lanes, but aircraft spotted and cleared them with growing efficiency. Even the boldest U-boat commanders admitted privately that the war had passed them by. Patrols turned into acts of endurance rather than combat, with boats spending weeks evading rather than attacking. The pride of the U-boat arm, its offensive spirit, had been broken. Dönitz's strategies, once hailed as masterstrokes, now seemed like relics, and the submariners carried them out with resignation instead of faith. For the men aboard these new boats and wielding these new weapons, the experience was one of cruel irony. They sailed vessels that were theoretically superior, but in a strategic environment already lost. Crews trained on the Type XX-1 dreamed of unleashing it in 1941, when it might have changed history. Instead, they found themselves commissioning in 1945, sent on futile missions as Germany crumbled. Men manning acoustic torpedoes knew their weapons could not guarantee success against decoys. Those operating snorkels endured misery that felt like punishment rather than innovation, and commanders recognized that the ocean they once dominated was now an arena stacked against them. The bravery of the crews was undeniable, but their sacrifices brought nothing but delay. Technology had arrived too slowly to overcome the industrial and organizational power of the Allies, and that delay sealed the fate of the Atlantic War. Dönitz himself was left to confront the bitter reality of his hopes undone. His fleet, once the terror of the seas, had become a dwindling remnant fighting for survival. The new weapons he had promised Hitler as salvation proved to be footnotes rather than turning points. He had believed in the submarine as the decisive weapon of modern war, and for a time he was right, but Allied air power, intelligence and production had outpaced even the most ingenious designs. The Type XX would influence submarine warfare for decades, but it came too late to save the Reich. The snorkel, the acoustic torpedo, the coastal boats, all were innovations chasing a lost cause. What remained was a campaign defined by courage and futility, fought to the bitter end. The Battle of the Atlantic had already been decided by the spring of 1943. Everything after was desperation, and no invention could change its outcome. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was no longer about survival. It was about preparation for liberation. Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion in history, depended upon an unbroken chain of convoys crossing the ocean. From the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, From the shipyards of Halifax and New York, the lifeblood of war streamed eastward. Tanks, trucks, landing craft, and millions of tons of ammunition filled the holds of merchant vessels. Each ship became part of a colossal puzzle, its safe arrival critical for the assembly of Allied power in Britain. The North Atlantic, once a graveyard of ships, now became the highway of an army. In 1942, such a build-up would have been unthinkable, but by 1944, Allied superiority made it possible. Escort groups, hunter-killer teams, and air patrols turned every convoy into a moving fortress. The Atlantic had been tamed, and in its safety lay the foundation of D-Day. The scale of this logistical operation was staggering. In the months before June 1944, more than 1.5 million American troops were ferried across the ocean. Alongside them came nearly 200,000 vehicles, 14,000 aircraft, and mountains of supplies measured in millions of tons. Ports in Britain became oceans of crates, tanks, and landing craft stacked in endless rows. Merchant sailors, once fearing each voyage as a possible death sentence, now moved with a confidence earned by victory at sea. The convoys still faced dangers, but losses were dramatically reduced compared to the bloody years of 1940-43. Every ship that reached Liverpool or Glasgow strengthened the arm poised to strike at Hitler's fortress Europe. Without this steady flow, no invasion could have been mounted. D-Day was not merely a triumph of arms, but a triumph of logistics secured across the Atlantic. The battlefield of Normandy began on the docks of Halifax and New York, and it was won in the shipping lanes of the ocean. Ultra-intelligence played a silent but vital role in protecting these lifelines. At Bletchley Park, code breakers continued to read German naval traffic, deciphering U-boat orders almost as they were sent. Convoys could be rerouted away from danger, slipping past Wolfpacks still clinging to survival in the Bay of Biscay. Hunter-killer groups were vectored toward U-boats setting up ambushes, striking before they could menace invasion shipping. The secrecy surrounding Ultra remained absolute, with only a handful of senior commanders aware of its full power. Allied sailors never knew why convoys sometimes altered course at the last moment, but they trusted the unseen hand guiding them. Each decrypted message saved lives and safeguarded cargo critical to the invasion. For Dönitz's men, the ocean seemed cursed, every attempt at interception frustrated by uncanny Allied foresight. In reality, their Enigma messages betrayed them daily. The Atlantic War had become a chessboard, and the Allies now read every move. In the spring of 1944, the German U-boat threat was not gone, but it was diminished. The once mighty Wolfpacks had been reduced to scattered remnants, bloodied and battered by years of losses. New snorkel-equipped submarines attempted to prowl the shipping lanes, but their impact was marginal. Escort carriers and long-range aircraft dominated the seas, hunting submarines with a thoroughness never before possible. Each patrol became a gauntlet, with U-boats fighting to survive rather than to strike. German commanders recognized that their days of dictating the tempo of the Atlantic War were long past. For Allied planners, this meant that the build-up for Overlord could proceed with unprecedented security. Every soldier, every Sherman tank, every can of fuel depended on the absence of U-boats in decisive numbers. The ocean that once threatened Britain's survival now promised Europe's liberation, and it was the victory at sea that made invasion possible. The Normandy landings themselves revealed the transformation of the Atlantic struggle. On June 6, 1944, an armada of nearly 7,000 vessels crossed the Channel in the greatest fleet ever assembled. Minesweepers cleared paths, destroyers guarded flanks, and troopships poured men onto French beaches. Behind them, the convoys that had fed Britain for years now delivered directly into the heart of the invasion. German U-boats attempted to intervene, but their presence was scattered and ineffective. A handful of attacks struck isolated ships, but the vast majority of the invasion force arrived unharmed. Allied naval supremacy, built through years of sacrifice, was absolute. Dönitz's desperate orders to attack were met with silence from boats destroyed or pinned down. The U-boat war that once threatened nations could not even slow the advance on Normandy, and with that failure, Germany's last hope at sea collapsed. The psychological reversal was striking. In 1941, British sailors spoke of sailing into a graveyard with every crossing. By 1944, the same ocean carried them with confidence, the enemy now the one haunted by inevitability. Merchant captains remembered when a voyage to Liverpool was a test of fate. Now it was routine, almost mundane in comparison. Submariners who once stalked the Atlantic as hunters now crept beneath waves, praying only to return alive. Families in Britain, once living on rationed bread and fear of starvation, now saw supplies flowing steadily. American soldiers, massing in England for the Great Assault, ate meals their fathers could scarcely imagine during the Depression. The Atlantic had ceased to be a barrier and had become a bridge. It was the artery through which the invasion's lifeblood flowed, and its security was one of the Allies' greatest victories. The Battle of the Atlantic and D-Day were not separate campaigns. They were one continuous struggle. Without victory in the Atlantic, the invasion could never have been mounted, much less sustained. Every rifle fired in Normandy, every tank rolling inland, every aircraft overhead was delivered by sea. The vast Allied armies in France lived and fought on supplies carried across the waves. When historians speak of Normandy, they speak also of Halifax, New York, and Liverpool, for the road to France began there. The U-boats had sought to sever this road, and failed. Ultra, escort carriers, hunter-killer groups, and the courage of countless sailors had preserved it. The liberation of Europe was thus a victory of convoys as much as of soldiers, and the Battle of the Atlantic had its final vindication on the beaches of Normandy. By the summer of 1944, the Atlantic War's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had secured the sea lanes, delivered their armies, and turned the ocean into their strongest ally. Germany, once threatening Britain's very survival, could no longer contest even the waters off its own coast. The convoys continued to flow, not in desperation, but in triumph. Dönitz's submarines, scattered and diminished, were powerless against the tide of Allied strength, and with the success of D-Day, the strategic link between ocean and battlefield was complete. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun as a fight for survival in 1939. By 1944, it had become the guarantor of liberation. The longest battle had shaped the greatest invasion, and through it, the Atlantic had carried the hope of freedom to a continent in chains. By the autumn of 1944, the U-boat war had shrunk from a global campaign to a desperate struggle for survival. Allied supremacy in the Atlantic was now total, with radar-equipped aircraft patrolling from Iceland to the Azores and hunter-killer groups roaming the seas. Yet Dönitz still ordered patrols, driven by duty, desperation, and the faint hope of technological miracles. New snorkel-equipped U-boats were dispatched from the battered French bases, now retreating under Allied advance. Many sailed not as hunters but as fugitives, trying to break into the Atlantic through gauntlets of mines and patrols. Each mission became a one-way gamble, with survival measured in weeks rather than months. The submariners who once carried the confidence of the happy times now carried resignation in their eyes. They knew the odds were against them before they ever left port. Still they went, bound by oath and by the iron discipline of the Kriegsmarine. The final patrols had begun, and they were journeys into futility. The schnorkel, promised as salvation, proved more torment than relief. U-boats could remain submerged for days, but conditions inside became unbearable. Diesel fumes filled the compartments, coating lungs and throats with a suffocating haze. Condensation dripped constantly from the ceilings, soaking bedding and food alike. Carbon monoxide levels rose to dangerous heights, causing headaches, nausea, and hallucinations among exhausted crews. The thin mast, protruding just above the surface, still betrayed them to Allied radar sweeps. Many commanders described patrolling with the schnorkel as living in a coffin that stank of oil and poison. The once proud German submariner became a prisoner of his own technology. What was meant to restore stealth only prolonged misery, and with every patrol, hope drained further away. Allied dominance ensured that even leaving port became a deadly risk. The Bay of Biscay, once a gateway to the Atlantic, had become a killing ground patrolled day and night by RAF Coastal Command. Liberators, Sunderlands, and Mosquitoes prowled the skies, dropping depth charges the moment a periscope or schnorkel betrayed its presence. U-boats often suffered damage before they ever reached the open sea. Sailors began to call the passage the Valley of Death, a phrase whispered with dread as they prepared to sail. Mines laid by Allied aircraft and destroyers further hemmed in German bases. Every departure felt less like the start of a patrol and more like the beginning of a funeral march. For the men inside, each dive carried the weight of inevitability. Their courage was undiminished, but their chances of victory were gone. The final patrols were voyages into the shadow of defeat. Despite overwhelming odds, German U-boats still fought with ferocity when opportunities arose. In late 1944 and early 1945, scattered successes were achieved against isolated freighters and unwary escorts. A few Allied ships went down in fire and smoke, testament to the lethal potential of submarines even in decline. Crews celebrated these rare victories with subdued pride, aware they did little to alter the wider war. Every sinking, however, drew instant retaliation, with hunter-killer groups descending upon the area within hours. Submarines that escaped one encounter often limped home, battered, leaking, and depleted. The glory of the Wolfpacks had given way to fleeting triumphs, overshadowed by relentless losses. Even the Type XX-1 Electra boot, revolutionary in design, could not arrive in time to change the war. By the time it entered service, Germany itself was collapsing. The U-boat fleet remained formidable in design, but powerless in reality. For the Allies, hunting U-boats had become a science perfected. Sonar, radar, lee lights, and ultra-intelligence combined into an unbreakable net. Escort carriers and destroyer escorts roamed the seas in hunter-killer groups, striking wherever submarines dared to rise. Coastal air patrols left no sanctuary, forcing U-boats to hide in deeper waters where supplies dwindled. Every attack demonstrated not only technological mastery, but also overwhelming industrial superiority. The Allies could lose ships and replace them. The Germans could not replace men or machines fast enough. Each patrol cost Dönitz resources he no longer had, and each loss weakened the Kriegsmarine beyond repair. Yet patrols continued, driven by Hitler's orders and the refusal to surrender without resistance. For Allied sailors, the U-boat was still a threat, but no longer an existential one. For German sailors, the sea had become their graveyard. The war beneath the waves was ending in tragedy. The human toll of these final months was catastrophic. Young recruits, many barely trained, were rushed aboard submarines to replace the mounting casualties. They faced voyages with commanders who knew the war was lost, but carried on regardless. Families in Germany received telegrams almost daily, reporting sons, brothers, and fathers missing at sea. Morale crumbled under the weight of loss, but discipline ensured obedience to the last. In cramped steel coffins, men clung to routine, cooking meager meals, writing letters they knew might never be delivered. Fear became constant, broken only by the sudden violence of depth charges exploding around the hull. Survivors of attacks described the agony of waiting in silence as rivets popped and bulkheads groaned. Few returned to tell their stories. For most, the Atlantic became their unmarked grave. The final patrols consumed them in silence and steel. By early 1945, the Reich itself was crumbling, and with it the U-boat fleet. Bases in France had been lost, forcing operations from Norway under even harsher conditions. Fuel shortages crippled patrols, with many boats stranded at dock for lack of diesel. Training programs collapsed as veteran crews were annihilated. Hitler demanded miracles, but Dönitz could only deliver losses. Type XX-1 Submarines emerged from shipyards, sleek and advanced, but too few and too late. Allied armies marched toward Berlin, while Allied navies sealed the oceans. In this final stage, U-boats no longer represented strategy. They symbolized defiance. Their presence at sea was a gesture of resistance in the face of inevitable defeat. The longest battle was ending, and the end carried no victory for Germany. When the war finally closed in May 1945, the U-boat fleet surrendered in silence. More than 150 boats were handed over to Allied forces, their proud commanders reduced to captives. Many others were scuttled by their own crews to avoid falling into enemy hands. Dönitz, briefly Germany's head of state after Hitler's death, ordered compliance with Allied terms. The men who had once stalked the oceans returned broken, their sacrifice unmatched, yet ultimately futile. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, was now the domain of their enemies. For survivors, the memories of claustrophobic dives and doomed comrades never faded. For the world, the U-boat war became both legend and warning. The final patrols had ended, and with them, the last hopes of the Kriegsmarine. The sea had swallowed Germany's greatest gamble. The Battle of the Atlantic left behind more than wrecks scattered on the seafloor. It left a blueprint for modern naval warfare. It demonstrated with ruthless clarity that sea power was not measured only in battleships, but in the ability to sustain supply lines. Britain survived because convoys carried grain, oil, steel, and soldiers across an unforgiving ocean. The lesson was simple but profound. Logistics win wars, and the side that secures its arteries of supply secures its survival. Commanders from Eisenhower to Montgomery would later say that victory in Europe began not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the convoys that fed Britain. Without that secure lifeline, every rifle, tank, and shell would have been nothing more than an empty promise. The convoys taught militaries that strategy must protect logistics as fiercely as it does armies in the field. The U-boat Menace forced the Allies to master this truth earlier than they wished, and it reshaped the art of war for the modern age. The technological revolutions of the Atlantic War became the seeds of future naval doctrine. Radar, sonar, and long-range aircraft extended the eyes and ears of escort groups into every corner of the ocean. The invention of the Hedgehog mortar and the refinement of depth charges changed anti-submarine warfare from a game of chance into a science of precision. Escort carriers, once experimental, became indispensable, combining aviation with convoy defense in ways that foreshadowed post-war doctrine. High-frequency direction finding, Huff-Duff proved that electronic intelligence could be as decisive as any weapon, and at the heart of it all was Bletchley Park, whose cryptanalysts transformed mathematics into a weapon of war. The bomber and the ultra-decrypts did not fire torpedoes, but they sank submarines all the same. These innovations would outlive the war, feeding into Cold War technologies that still echo today. The Atlantic campaign thus stood as the laboratory of the future. In its crucible, modern naval warfare was born. Yet beyond machines, it was human endurance that defined the struggle. Merchant sailors braved freezing seas, cramped bunks, and the constant spectre of fire and drowning. They were civilians in uniform only by necessity, yet their courage rivaled any soldier at the front. Escort crews lived with relentless tension, scanning every wave for the glint of a periscope or the shimmer of a snorkel. RAF aircrews flew endless patrols over the grey void of the Atlantic, their reward often hours of monotony punctuated by sudden violence. At Bletchley Park, codebreakers worked in silence and secrecy, never allowed to share the weight of what they knew. Wives, mothers, and children kept homes going, while telegrams arrived with news of losses that barely made the headlines. The war in the Atlantic was fought by thousands whose names never appeared in history books. They bore the strain without glory, yet their endurance made Allied victory possible. Without them, strategy and technology would have been meaningless. For Germany, the legacy of the U-boat campaign was one of brilliance undone by overreach. Dönitz's Wolfpack doctrine was revolutionary, and his submariners fought with courage and skill. But industrial limits, technological gaps, and the Allies' ability to innovate turned German aggression into attrition. The Type XXX-1 Electroboot hinted at a future that might have changed the war had it arrived earlier. Yet its debut came too late, buried under Allied bombs and dwindling resources. For German families, the legacy was tragedy: 36,000 submariners lost, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the Wehrmacht. Villages in northern Germany became graveyards in spirit, mourning sons who never returned from the sea. Dönitz himself would later admit that the U-boat arm, once his pride, had been bled white by the Atlantic War. Germany's defeat at sea was not just tactical, but existential. It crippled the Reich's ability to fight on equal terms. For the Allies, the Atlantic War became the hidden cornerstone of victory. The campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy all rested on supplies carried across the ocean. Even the Soviet Union, battered on the Eastern Front, received vital convoys through Arctic waters protected by British and American escorts. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a side campaign. It was the connective tissue of the entire Allied war effort. Every theatre depended on it, and every soldier marched on rations shipped across the sea. Eisenhower himself declared that the U-boat peril had been his greatest fear in planning the war. That fear was conquered by a coalition of navies, air forces, and civilians working in unison. The Allied victory in Europe was born not only from the courage of infantry, but from the resilience of sailors. The Atlantic was their battlefield, and their triumph ensured all others, in silence and steel, they won the decisive struggle. The campaign also reshaped the relationship between intelligence and warfare. Never before had secrecy been so important, with ultra-decrypts concealed even from many commanders in the field. The Allies learned to mask their use of intelligence, staging feints and fabrications to hide the source. Deception operations like those before D-Day became possible, only because Ultra could be trusted to remain hidden. This new model of war, blending information with firepower, set the stage for the Cold War intelligence race. Cryptography, once the domain of scholars, became a weapon of nations. In the code-breakers' machines lay the roots of modern computing, with Alan Turing's work serving as the foundation for an entire industry. Thus, the Battle of the Atlantic did not end with the last U-boat surrender. It continued into the age of computers, satellites, and nuclear submarines. Its legacy was not just military but technological, shaping the future of the world. Culturally, the memory of the Atlantic War became both somber and proud. In Britain, The merchant navy was finally recognized for its sacrifice, though often too late for those it had lost. In Canada, corvette sailors remembered nights of terror in icy seas as the nation claimed its place among the great naval powers. In Germany, the U-boat war became both a symbol of sacrifice and a reminder of futility, its memorials tinged with grief. Memorial plaques, maritime museums, and preserved U-boats kept alive the stories of those who had fought beneath the waves. Families carried the scars for generations, with entire communities shaped by the losses. Literature and film returned again and again to the imagery of convoys and submarines, dramatizing the tension of a battle fought in darkness and silence. The Atlantic was not forgotten. It became legend, and with that legend came lessons for all who looked to the sea. History remembered the Atlantic as both graveyard and lifeline. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was the longest, most relentless campaign of the Second World War. It stretched from the first day of the conflict in 1939 to the final surrender in 1945. It claimed tens of thousands of lives, consumed thousands of ships, and spanned millions of square miles. Yet its outcome defined the war itself. The Allies secured the seas, and with them secured victory. The convoys that once trembled under attack became the arteries of liberation. The U-boats that once stalked the ocean became relics of defiance, drowned in the tide of Allied power. The legacy of this battle lay not only in wreckage beneath the waves, but in the endurance of the people who fought it. From sailors to codebreakers, from air crews to shipbuilders, their collective will overcame Germany's greatest weapon, and in doing so they ensured that freedom would cross the ocean and reclaim Europe. The Atlantic War ended, but its lessons endure forever.